Ready? Good. Okay. Good evening and welcome to the September 11th, 2024 Open Space Board of Trustees meeting. My name is Michelle Estrella and I am the chair. First order of business is to call the roll. Trustee Carroll,
Present.
Trustee Glynn,
Present.
Robinson,
Present.
and Zuckerman.
Here.
And I'm here, so we have a full board tonight. Wonderful. Okay, let's move on to approval of the minutes. As usual, we will go page by page and ask for any comments or suggested changes. I'm looking at page 1. Do we have any comments or changes? Okay, seeing none. Page 2. And the third and final, page 3. Any comments or changes? No? Okay, seeing none, let's go ahead and entertain a motion to approve. Anybody?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Okay,
I'll second.
and then I'll call the roll. I'll start with you, Sarah, since your mic's on.
Yes.
Okay, and Harmon
Yes.
and Brady?
Yes.
I also vote yes. I think you have to.
I'll abstain as I was not present.
Excellent, thank you. So passes unanimously. All right, next section is public comment. We have 2 public hearings tonight. This is a time for the public to speak about matters that are not related to management area designations, nor the Boulder Erie Regional Trail. Thanks. Sam, can you read the rules of decorum, please?
Yes, thank you. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement processes, please visit this link. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. These will be upheld during this meeting. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. Participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. If you would like to speak in person tonight and you did not sign up in advance, we do have those 3 sections of public comment tonight, and you can sign up over here. Again, that is only if you haven't signed up in advance and you'd like to speak in person. If you're joining us online and you'd like to speak and haven't signed up in advance, you can raise your hand. So you can either use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, or you'll see the click the participants box. You'll see 3 dots on the bottom right. You can click that and then select raise your hand. Okay, so we're going to start with folks who signed up in advance. So first we have Giles Troughton, and then followed by Ayana Rail.
My name is Giles Trout, I live in Boulder. I address the board.
Oh, Giles, sorry. Thank you. Could you start over?
Okay, sure.
We'll restart your time. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. My name is Giles Troutman. I live in Boulder. I addressed this group last month as well. I'm here to talk about some of the same things that I mentioned last month. I appreciate the opportunity for public comment. I'm less a fan of a monologue. I like a dialogue better, so if anybody wants to have a dialogue, I'm happy to engage in that process with you guys. Here to talk about Flagstaff Road a little bit about history, question about wildfire funding, and then I just want to touch on a BRL article on homeowners insurance that made its way into the media this week. Um, Response from the Boulder County Sheriff Office I got about a month ago said, although Flagstaff is not a county road, is a county road, it's traditionally been managed by OSMP. And I'm just curious as to why this decision was originally made, when it was made, if it's a formal legal transfer of responsibility and authority, and what, if anything, may have changed since that original decision might have been made, and whether or not the original rationale for that decision still holds true today. So I addressed the board last month, and I'm here again to share that my neighborhood continues to have concerns regarding the crime and the wildfire risk that occurs along the Flagstaff Road corridor. Fireworks continue to be present at Panorama Point. I can hear them 4 days a week, usually both weekend days and a couple days during the week. What I would call street racing continues to happen on a weekly basis. And I don't know if this falls into the Flagstaff Road territory or not, but earlier today, I guess there was a stabbing somewhere in the Tenderfoot Trail area. So I guess my comment is that it appears that what you may be doing currently, what OSMP may be doing currently, might not be working in terms of enforcement protocols, and nobody would have expected dramatic change within just a month from the last time I spoke. I think that the CWPP is going to have an implementation coordinator program within OSMP. I reiterate my concerns that there was no detailed analysis of fire incident causation in any of the CWPPs. I think coordination with the Boulder County CWPP is really called for. And I'm concerned that a hotline post that was issued by a council member earlier this week highlighted a 29% decrease in wildfire resilience funding in the proposed budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles, and thanks for coming in person this evening. Just to clarify, we can't have a dialogue here. This is more about providing your input to the board. I think that you did ask some good questions, though, about the ownership, and I will ask maybe staff to just get some answers around those questions, and hopefully we can make that available.
Yeah, just to be clear, I wasn't expecting a dialogue
Okay.
tonight. If anybody wants to engage outside of tonight's forum,
Okay.
completely open to that.
Okay. Thanks. I'm sorry I misunderstood you.
That's okay. Thank you.
Next, we have Ayana Rael. If you're attending in person, you can come up to the podium. And I don't see them attending online. If you'd like to speak online, you can raise your hand now. Okay, no hands.
Okay, I will go ahead and, whoa. I'll go ahead and close public comment. We'll move on to matters from the board. We are first going to talk about trustee questions on written information items or other things that trustees might want to talk about. We have 3 items that were provided in the memo that are not on the agenda. One was the update on Flagstaff management, which I think is relevant to what Giles was bringing up. Did he leave? Sorry. And the second is Marshall Mesa Trailhead improvements and the remediation project going on there. And the third is the visitor use monitoring reports. I guess I would like to start with, if we do go through the comments, I'd like to save the Marshall Mesa Trailhead one for last because it kind of goes into item 4B, if that's okay. All right. All right, let's start with the Flagstaff Management memo.
It was a sobering read, I guess I would say. And it would appear that we need to, I don't know, I don't know if I have any solutions, but yeah, it was a sobering read.
Indeed. I'm glad that you are embarking on a more holistic review of what happens on Flagstaff. I do want to make one set of comments about the memo itself, in which you mentioned that you will be terminating the permitting process, or the permitting process for climbers to request a permit to climb at night. And I just want to say that I find it disappointing that we were not able to find a solution that worked for climbers. I don't know if you know this, Brady, but you had to request a permit 7 days in advance of the time that you wanted to go bouldering up there, and that's just not how climbing and climbers really work. It's a lot of like weather dependent. And I'm not sure why we couldn't find a process that worked more similarly to the HCA permit request form, in which you could get one immediately. I know that there was some discussion about whether the permit is taken with you on your person versus on your car. I didn't really understand why we couldn't find a solution there, but I really find it disappointing that we couldn't find a way to allow the good actors to continue to use the land. And it is a loss for climbers. I understand that it's important that we get things under control there. I just feel like that we are penalizing the good actors and really doing not a lot for the bad actors. So that's the point that I wanted to make regarding Flagstaff and that memo. Did anything else? Did you, Brady? Okay.
Thanks for that. I mean, I guess I'm not surprised that that particular parking permit regime didn't succeed, and based on the almost very limited use, I understand why y'all are discontinuing it. I just came away, and I'm kind of looking at it again to see if I missed anything. I'm just coming away from this memo, trying to find some glimmers of hope. And I look forward to more updates in the future on what we're going to do to address the management challenges up there.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Okay, so any comments or questions about the visitor use monitoring reports topic outline? None? Okay. I'll move on to the Marshall Mesa Trailhead improvements. Does anybody want to make any comments about that memo? Okay. All right, not surprisingly, I do have some comments.
I also
Oh,
do,
sorry.
sorry, just still, okay, yes. But go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah. I'll go last.
Okay. Let me pull up. This is me when I'm prepared, then I have to dig through all my prepared notes. I do want to say on the topic of Flagstaff that I feel that we can, I think it doesn't look great, and I feel that through partnerships within the city, we're going to be able to address it, and the first step is acknowledging that there's a problem. So thank you for putting together that report, and I'm glad that we are really taking actionable, that we're, when we put things into black and white like this, it acknowledges that there's a problem, and that's how we can spring forward into action. So that feels like a good first step, and I look forward to continuing to stay abreast to how we address it through collaboration with other city entities. Okay, so on the topic of okay, I actually just wrote a quick letter to our board of trustees and to the community members. I would like to express my support for the coordinated efforts between Open Space and Mountain Parks Department and the Colorado Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety on the Marshall Mesa Trailhead renovation and coal steam mitigation project. However, I also want to ensure that we keep a critical issue at the forefront of our decision-making and public conversations about that area. What really struck me last meeting is that, and from the memos that we received following, is that the root cause here is ultimately coal mining and fires, the reason why we are here today working on this project. Well, at the heart of this project is a site that has been severely impacted by a legacy of coal mining and the Marshall Fire. To me, this area represents what is essentially an environmental disaster zone. And what we are doing here is nothing short of rebuilding and preserving. As we move forward, I feel that it is vital that we recognize this trailhead renovation as not just a recreational project, but as a healing process for the land. I believe that we must be careful to allocate our resources, times, and team with laser focus on long-term fire mitigation and environmental restoration. The impact of these disasters, both mining and fire, cannot be understated. The cost, disruption, and time required to recover from this is substantial, and we must approach this project with a conservative use of resources that prioritizes the long-term health of the ecosystem. I think that we have an issue of balancing recreation and ecosystem protection always at the forefront of these conversations. And I do fully acknowledge that we need to put public safety of our children first, and also acknowledge that recreation is what makes our city great. However, I think that we cannot lose sight of the bigger ecosystem that ensures the long-term safety and health of our children and community and supports recreation. If we want to continue enjoying the land, we must take care of it. And when we fail to do so, or when we get distracted with more short-sighted issues, the balance tips and the consequences ripple through our community, affecting our children, our way of life, and our future. So I just want to really emphasize that this project is not only about creating safe access to trailheads for biking and walking during the renovations, it's ultimately about protecting, repairing, and preserving the land that sustains all of us. Our ultimate duty is to the land, and we must ask ourselves if we are giving as much as we are taking. With that said, I am going to just be keeping an eye on how we're spending our resources on this project, including the short-term planning and safety considerations, as well as ultimately supporting our long-term goal. And I think that educating the community about the impact of fire and bringing together the youth and having a conversation as we repair and restore this land, I think is actually something that we should be spending time and intention on as a board of trustees and also as a community. So I encourage us to proceed with that as our focus, and the time and energy that the staff and the city is putting towards this short term. What are we doing in the short term? How are we building bridges? How are we giving access? I think we really need to be considering these deeper questions and educating ourselves in the community as we go along. And ultimately, when this project is finished, I hope that we together as a community will feel that we have not only achieved the restoration, but also gained momentum as a community on these bigger questions of land preservation and fire prevention.
Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned you wanted to go last, so
Yeah.
I'll go now. I wanted to thank staff for acting so quickly to, get the temporary trail in the plan after our feedback. Would love to see us think about that, earlier in the process in the future, but really wanted to thank how quickly we got that together. It was really fast and really appreciated.
Yeah, also, I thought it was a great memo. I'm glad that you put that out before City Council actually met the last go around. So I think that was really helpful, because I had been having a lot of conversations with council members about that. And appreciate the fact that you're building a temporary trail, and I'm super excited that you will hopefully engage the high school students to help build it. I think that will be an excellent opportunity for them to connect with the land and appreciate what they have to bike on. So would love to also get my kids out there if we set a date to do that. So thanks for doing that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the subcommittee meeting, but it also is related to the Marshall Mesa Trailhead. I'm blending those two items. The subcommittee has met twice in the last month since we had a board meeting, once on September 3rd and another time on August 29th. It was clear that there wasn't space in the work plan to address the urgent issue of providing safe access um, uh, to the Marshall and Mesa trails for South Boulder residents and the bike teams who bike to the trailhead um, prior to its closure in October. So I realize that in this conversation and appreciate staff walking through us with that in the subcommittee. And we are going to work on a temporary trail that at least maintains the status quo in terms of safety. Before I go into next steps on how we should address this issue sort of more broadly, you know, in the context of multimodal access to our system, I want to highlight three major things that are happening in South Boulder. One is the closure of CU South, which is a place where a lot of people walk, run, bike, and that's coming pretty soon. I don't know when. There's the Marshall Mesa Trailhead that is also going to be closed. Absolutely agree that this work is completely necessary and definitely have never advocated delaying that remediation work and then the trailhead work that would happen soon after that. And as we also know, or those trustees here who've looked at the work plan and the budget, that South Mesa Trailhead is up next to be closed. And these three major construction properties disproportionately affect South Boulder residents, and they also, in particular, affect bikers. So something to be aware of. Wanted to point that out. Bikers don't actually have that many trails within the system here in City of Open Space Mountain Parks. And it is not practice, at least from what I've observed, for the department to adaptively manage to accommodate decreases in capacity in certain areas or certain user groups when that's being done to increase it elsewhere on the system. And nor have I really seen an effort to develop an alternative transportation management plan when these things are happening, especially when there are a lot of projects that are concentrated in one part of our town. And so what ends up happening here is that that a certain subset of users get more heavily impacted, and they end up going to an already limited resource of biking trails and end up using that more. And I know that's something that when we talk about capacity, shoving more people in one area, but because it's necessary because you're closing other areas is not an ideal situation. So wanted to make that observation. I do want to propose that we take up the issue of a multimodal access to our system within this next year, and I think we ought to. I'd like to propose that we talk about it at our OSBT retreat that's coming up in October, and think through like what it is that the board would be interested in. And I know this goes into item 4C when we talk about the retreat, but I think it's a good use of our time to talk about what it is we would like to see, especially when it comes to safety, especially when it comes to our climate commitment, and how alternative access, meaning accessing our trails outside of our car, can be realized, especially on trails that already exist. Ironically, an alternative solution would have actually alleviated some of the pressure on all three of those projects. So I think we'll talk a little bit about a little more about the retreat here, but that's one item I would like to make sure that we have plenty of time for. And then I'd like to also ask staff to consider delaying the South Mesa Trailhead construction. I know it's approved in the budget. It's in the planned work plan. But perhaps consider reallocating those resources who would be doing similar work to do the parking lot or trailhead that's up near Joder. We all got a chance to, well, the two of us got a chance to ride it with Jeff, and there are not many parking spaces there. I believe that that's already scoped out in the North TSA plan. And I think it would be similar resources that would work on the South Mesa versus the versus up near Joder. So would like to just pitch that as a possibility. And that would allow us the space and the time to explore a broader public input process about how we have multimodal access to our system, particularly in the South Boulder part of the system, or the south part of the system. Okay, those are my comments. Thank you. Okay, I'll move on to the next item, which is the OSBT retreat subcommittee. And that'd be Harmon or Brady?
It's me,
Okay.
yeah. So we had a brief meeting about it, and Dan, you did send that email out soliciting topics, which I missed. So without naming names, do we have 100% participation yet in that?
Sarah, who has participated in it.
Congratulations.
Hey.
Extra cookie for you.
Thank you.
The rest of us, shame on us. So Dan has asked for retreat topics. So every year we have a retreat. A few of us get together and try to chart out the best, most efficient use of our time that doesn't include sitting still the entire time. So Dan did send out a call for topics. Your multimodal request is duly noted with the addendum that we will also be talking about people who happen to live in North Boulder. You said South Boulder focus, so we'll just focus on the whole community. But the staff has got some ideas on good topics. Then the committee, the three of us, have come up with a few ideas, and then we will incorporate the ones that come from the email to everybody. We'll come back together and propose. Daniel sent out a proposed agenda. Is that the next step after we combine everything? Everyone's input?
Yeah, maybe at the next meeting, we'll propose a draft agenda and get some comments at the
Yeah.
October business meeting.
Yeah, and so we've got a number of slots to sit and chat. We will have a working lunch, and we've made a few adjustments from last agendas, and we will have at least 1 hour to kind of walk around and see some of the beautiful places that we're working to protect and manage. And so, unless there's specific questions, we can probably keep that short.
No specific questions, but just wanted to take another jab at you. I was actually
please.
thinking about.
Please.
I was
Please do.
actually thinking about the North Boulder people, because if all of those cyclists end up going to North Boulder, there's not enough parking at the Joder Ranch.
Oh,
And
so
then
you are
they would
concerned
end
about
up
us.
and they would end up parking in the Dakota neighborhood, and that would not be a positive outcome either.
Yeah.
So anyway,
All joking
thinking
aside,
about it.
these things are complicated and people get displaced. And I think your point, Michelle, that when a lot of things in one region are under construction and closed, that we should be thinking about it is well taken. So thank you.
Can I just, don't we have an underlying, do I remember from the presentation at my first board meeting that we have to actually mitigate the coal, what's happened because of the fires with the coal mining combination. So we have to be doing something down there. And
I don't think anybody's disputing that. The project that is happening there, and we're talking about how do we adaptively manage around it. So nobody's suggesting that we delay it.
Oh, I
that we
thought,
stop
okay,
it.
okay,
That
great.
we're absolutely moving forward with it. It's the combination of CU South, that and South Mesa Trailhead that's going to create a lot of displacement.
Uh-huh.
And so, how do we adaptively manage the rest of the system because of it? Nobody has suggested, absolutely, we need to do that work. Nobody, I've not even heard anybody say that we ought to delay it.
Okay, so
And I
it's
know
the
that I made
South
that clear
Mesa.
last month
Okay,
too.
great.
Yeah, there's
Mhm.
no,
Okay,
there hasn't been any comments about that.
okay,
It's how do we manage the rest of the system?
okay,
And
great.
you had a good idea. I guess one of your first meetings was about how could we like say, hey, you wanted to go to this trailhead, here's a like trailhead,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Go here because if you like this aspect of it, go to this other. And so that was a great idea. However, that doesn't work if you're a biker because
Mhm.
there's only so many other places you could go. So
Mhm.
we don't want to send people up to North Sky. First of all, they'd have to drive, right? Because 30% of the people who access the Marshall Mesa Trailhead actually bike there,
Mhm.
but then they have to get into a car, and then they don't have a place to park.
Mhm.
So that would be either the Dakota neighborhood or that's like, how do we manage that? How can we open up? You can't. There's not a really good solution to say, you like this? Go to Jeffco. That's kind of the answer. So that's where that's coming from, not at all from a place of delaying the project.
If I could just clarification, one of the exciting aspects of the North Sky Trail is it does provide quite a nice connection to trails to the south and the north of North Sky. So you can actually start at Wonderland Lake or even further south of the city and actually bike and then access North Sky Trail. So you don't need to bike to Joder or drive to Joder in order to bike North Sky. I think that's why a lot of folks were excited about it, is because it provides access from many points throughout the city and our trail system. So just wanted to make that clarification if folks are wondering.
Can I just add to the, this is all great conversation. And to Dan's point, you know, interestingly enough, in fact, in your packet, we've outlined several meetings worth of content and agenda items that are coming forward. And so I think what I'm hearing, just listening to the conversation, one is understanding what the work plan is and what projects we're working on, and is there some flexibility or pliability that we can kind of adjust and move those things around. I certainly hear that and note that. The other thing I hear is a lot about visitation and how folks are arriving to trailheads and access points, the modes they're using, how many people, is it crowded, that sort of thing. We actually, in your packet this evening and the next several meetings, and I'll talk more later in the agenda, but we'll be coming forward with a lot of visitation data, understanding our users, the visitors, how they're arriving, their preferences, visitation numbers at each trailhead, and that sort of thing. So that'll also help the board kind of start to identify, like, wow, okay, that's where we're seeing the visitation, the use, how people are arriving. So there's a lot, all that to say, there's a lot of agenda items coming up with the board that you'll be getting more information to make clear decisions and have an awareness. And then lastly, we are diving into our 25 work plan over the next few months as a department staff, as you mentioned earlier, Michelle. And so I think that's also a time that we can, both at the retreat and future meetings, talk through trade-offs, decisions, using the data we have and some of the information we provide you all with to help kind of have a collaborative discussion. So, and then I'll just say too, I really appreciate the letter that you mentioned, Sarah. The Marshall Mesa Trailhead, just so you're aware, in the written item, we had a lot of information, but that is a robust project that will really touch on education and interpretation, and we really use the term a lot of letting the land heal and understanding even the fire, as destructive as it was, there's some renewal and rebirth that comes out of that. And so we've got a lot of great plans actually to focus on that through education, teaching children and visitors about that when they visit the site with the new trailhead. But then also a wealth of fire mitigation strategies and climate action. So that's a brief summary of all the conversation I heard just over the past few minutes, and we can talk more.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, let's move on to management area designations. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. So we are on our fourth and final group. I think this is the third meeting because we had one meeting in which we combined management area designation recommendations and for two of the areas. So this will be our last time we're before you for a bit on MADS. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to one of our senior managers, Casey French, and then Juliet will also be helping to do the presentation.
Thanks, Dan. Just give me 1 second while I pull up the presentation.
Wasn't long enough.
No, it wasn't long enough.
It's a mad, mad world.
We'll just do this. So thank you. And so again, I'm going to kick off the presentation with just a very brief refresher of our management area designation, since I know most of you have learned about them during our previous board touches. And then Juliet will cover the specific recommendations for some properties. So the Visitor Master Plan first established our MADs in 2005, and so it established 4 designations. And it also established the landscape context for applying them. And the goal of MADs is to provide the context and the guidance on the management emphasis for an area. So I'm not going to delve into the criteria and the characteristics of each, because I've done that in the past. I just wanted to note that, again, like all of our OSMP charter purposes can occur across the management area designations. For example, recreation and agricultural do occur in all of our MADs. And again, the focus is on the management emphasis for an area. So in terms of where our management area designations fit into our plans, they provide broad, system-wide, and overarching guidance. The VMP is a system-wide plan that, along with others, are really used to inform and support site-specific management planning and operational management. So last year we identified there were approximately 40 properties that didn't have management area designations. And this project is really just focused on integrating those into the existing system. And to do this, we primarily look at the landscape context, meaning the adjacent management area designations, and again, the criteria and characteristics defined in the VMP. So in addition to assigning management area designations, we also did take a look at the open-close status of properties. So just as a reminder, upon acquisition, properties are immediately closed. Then soon after, the property is assessed to determine any immediate or short-term actions to integrate the property. And at that time, if the property can be opened, then that's what we do with minimal risk to sensitive resources. And otherwise, the property remains closed. So that's why we have the mix of properties we have today, where some are open and some closed. And again, we're just evaluating to see if any can be opened. So with that, I will turn things over to Juliet.
Thanks, Casey. So tonight I'll be sharing our recommendations for the 4th and final group of properties, as well as our recommendations for the Solomon and Hedgecock Life Estate properties within the Group 1 area, which we didn't bring to you with the rest of the Group 1 properties back in December. So within Group 4, we're recommending all 13 of these properties as natural areas. We're using the landscape context to integrate these properties into our system. Specific information about each property is included in your memo, so I'm not going to go into this in detail, but if you have any specific questions about any of the properties, I'll be happy to share that information. Within Group 4, 6 of the properties are open to public access and are recommended to remain open. 7 properties are closed, and of these closed properties, we're recommending that 2 of them be open, that the Oliver property remain closed for a few years for seed restoration to be established, and then that it be open. and that four properties remain closed given the CDOT mitigation work that was done there and restoration work that was done on those properties. And within Group 1, staff is recommending that the Solomon property be designated as HCA and added to the Tallgrass Prairie East HCA. While the resource values of this property are not in alignment with VMP criteria for HCA, it's recommended as this designation because the planning for this property would occur within the HCA landscape context. The Solomon property includes a narrow sliver of vegetated area directly adjacent to City of Louisville's Davidson Mesa open space on the east. As staff researched this property further since last December, we realized that a small portion of Louisville's trail encroaches onto the Solomon property. And so to address this, staff will be working with the City of Louisville to execute an appropriate agreement for trail enforcement and maintenance and to move an existing fence line to better delineate the boundary between OSMP owned or managed lands and Louisville's trail and lands. Solomon is currently open and recommended to remain open with these supporting actions. And like HCA properties, this would not allow off-trail travel without a permit. And this 15-acre portion of the broader 75-acre Hedgecock property had a life lease on it until the Hedgecock family no longer lived on it, and so it recently came under OSMP's management. And this property has similar high natural resource values as adjacent OSMP lands that are natural areas and is in alignment with VMP criteria for natural area. This property includes a portion of the South Boulder Creek corridor, wetlands, and has been identified as an area of outstanding biodiversity significance, an environmental conservation area, and a significant riparian corridor within the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan. It also includes historic structures and buildings, and the South Boulder Creek West Trail runs across the adjacent property to the north. So this life estate property is currently closed and recommended to remain closed to protect historic resources and for safety reasons. So that's our presentation, and we're happy to answer any clarifying questions. The recommendations we're proposing you make to City Council is on the slide for your reference, and if you have any feedback for staff on the other properties that don't require council approval.
Okay, let's start with clarifying questions, and then we'll do a public hearing, and then we'll have board discussion and entertain a motion. So, clarifying questions. Anybody? Okay, Harmon?
Yeah, I'm just curious. So, city purchased Hogan Pancast a few years ago, and it's just a small piece of property over there by East Boulder Rec Center. And I was just wondering if you could go a little deeper into what kind of study was done and what was found during the closed period, and you know why it's opened, and how you think staff is anticipating that it would be used as an open natural area.
Sure. So it does have similar resource values. As we looked at it in the context, it has similar resource values as kind of the surrounding properties. Several areas with native vegetation, habitat for Preble's meadow jumping mouse and northern leopard frog near the South Boulder Creek, providing habitat for those. And then it is currently closed, but it's recommended to be open to public access because of the kind of surrounding OSMP properties are open. We haven't gotten kind of further down to discuss more details as to what that could look like in the future, but that's kind of what we did at this phase of evaluation.
Yeah, and Harmon, you might have been involved in Hogan Pancast. So it was part of a much larger site, this 2.5 acres, which fell onto the east side of 55th. The larger portion was on the west side, and that became available for future utility use, as well as some possible passive parks and recreation type stuff. So OSMP was assigned the management of the 2.5 acres. And at that time, we also identified a possible light restoration of the wetland area. So that could be a future work plan work as we look to prioritize all of our potential restoration needs across the system. there could be a point in time where that rises to the level of doing some light restoration of that wetland complex there. And of course, this site is adjacent to the greater site plan implementation work that we're doing out there, and in which there'll be a new nearby designated trail provide access to 55th Street to the neighborhood, as well as across the creek. There's a lot of restoration plans and some recreation improvement plans there too, as far as that site plan.
So you're right. I did have a little history with the Hogan Pancos project when it was in front of planning board. So part of this was just to satisfy curiosity for me, and part of it is also just to understand a little bit better on how decisions to open and close are made at the staff level, and why these recommendations are coming in front of us like that. And so with Hogan Pancos not having any sort of open access, open use, off-trail kind of use proposed for it. Maybe you could just explain to me, describe why we would want to open a property without a management plan or a recreation plan, a trail plan. What's the purpose of opening a piece of property without a plan for its use?
Happy to help too.
When we looked at the surrounding area, all the adjacent properties were open and we haven't seen the resource damage. We haven't seen visitor use patterns that made us concerned that we would see damage to resources if we opened it. And as a general philosophy, we do try to open as many properties as we can if there aren't resource concerns obviously present. So we do default to try to open things. So
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
explaining it that way, Casey.
Yeah, or there could be cultural or resources or safety concerns, for instance, old buildings that aren't shored up or perhaps just in and of itself present some safety concerns. So we look at safety and cultural as well.
Other clarifying questions? I have one regarding Salomon. I know that giving it the HCA designation then adds the restriction of not being able to use it off trail or go off trail. Is it used for that purpose today? Do you know? Do people go off trail there? How hard will it be to enforce it, I guess?
So currently there is it's just the tiny little sliver, and people obviously are using the Davidson Mesa open space trail, and so there is the ability to go off trail. There wasn't too much evidence when we were out there that people were using off trail. But again, with the complexity of their trail actually being on our land, part of what we were discussing is actually moving our fence line from a separate property that's further west, moving our fence line so that it would clearly delineate our property boundary from Louisville's, so that it would be much harder to go off their trail and onto our property because of that.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other clarifying questions, let's go ahead and open up a public hearing.
Thank you. We don't have anyone signed up in advance to speak, and we don't have anyone signed up in person to speak. So if you'd like to speak online, go ahead and raise your hand now. And we do have one hand from Karen Holweg. So Karen, you should be able to unmute yourself now. And Karen, it looks like you're unmuted. If you want to say something, we might be able to hear you. Do you want to try one more time? I do see you're unmuted. Okay, I'm going to try one more time. Okay, I see you're unmuted again. Not. Okay, we're not hearing you. And we don't have any other hands online, so I'm just gonna try one more time. Okay, we're not able to hear you here, so if you don't mind just chatting in the Q&A and then we can come back if that's okay.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Or we can, okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So there's nobody, sorry.
No other hands.
Sorry, that wasn't able to work out for Karen. No other hands, and I'll go ahead and close the public hearing. And open up for board discussion.
Yeah, Michelle, I would just suggest if Karen is somehow able to get in before we finish deliberating, maybe we reopen just in case.
Okay, so board discussion? Okay, go ahead, Brady.
I mean, the recommendations seem reasonable. I like the posture that we open things unless there's a, reason we have to close them. So I would just want to acknowledge that. I think that's a great posture to have. And barring someone here changing my mind, I'm in favor of the staff recommendations.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, John, you were. I already said.
Oh, I also thought there were very reasonable recommendations, and as always when we do this, it's really satisfying to see the colors on the map be filled in. So I'm supportive of it as well.
You'd be a good staff person, John. We love that too.
Yeah, just piggybacking on what John just said, I also wanted to say that I think Steph did a great job bringing us these new MADs, these management area designations in bite-sized chunks, but in a really good pace so that we're familiar with the process as we have been approving or recommending approval of these different 4 different chunks of the valley that we've looked at over the last, whatever, it's been 9 months or something. So thank you for that.
I also find it very satisfying, and I bet you do too, to have finally gotten through all of these, even though the colors on the maps don't really help me, but yeah. Okay, so I think we can entertain a motion, and there's a suggestion there. Anybody?
Motion on the screen. Yeah.
Okay. I got it. I'll motion that we recommend to the Boulder City Council approve inclusion of the Solomon property as part of the Tallgrass Prairie East Habitat Conservation Area.
I'll second that. And any other discussion now that we have a motion seconded? No? Okay, I'll call the roll. Sarah?
Yes.
Brady?
Yes.
Herman?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And then I also vote for it, so it passes unanimously. Thank you. You get to stay put, is that right? Your trio over there? Okay.
This crew's staying.
Item number 6, back to you, Dan.
Yeah, well, first, just congratulations to the planning team for the MADS project. There's always about a year of pre-planning before we come to you, so a couple-year project for the staff. So thanks for the work over the last couple of years, and yeah, it's great to get caught up on the VMP 2005 VMP. Yeah, so we're moving into our second item, which is a public hearing and board consideration of a motion on the preferred alignment for further consideration and continued collaboration with Boulder County on the Boulder to Erie Regional Trail. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Juliet, I believe. Yep.
Thanks so much, Dan. You already eloquently expressed my first slide. So that is exactly why we're here. So a summary of the motion that we're requesting of the board is support of alignment 1B as the preferred alignment for further consideration, support of a commitment to follow Colorado Parks and Wildlife, or CPW, recommendations for raptor protection along the preferred alignment, support of the further exploration of acquisitions needed for Alignment 2 along Valmont, and support of OSMP's continued collaboration on the next phase of the project. And just a reminder that since the preferred alignment 1B is not on OSMP lands, city approval is not required, but a motion from OSBT is being requested to provide input into Boulder County Board of Commissioners deliberation and decision, and to serve as a record and guidance for future OSMP and OSBT participation. The goal of this planning effort was to identify and evaluate conceptual alignments and identify a preferred alignment for further consideration for an east to west multi-use trail connection between Boulder and Erie. And this trail connection has been identified in Boulder County's Transportation Master Plan, the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, and OSMP's Visitor Master Plan, and as such is an important collaborative effort for the City of Boulder and OSMP. And this has been a 6-year planning process throughout which OSMP has been involved, as the memo details. This planning process was led by the Boulder County Community Planning and Permitting Department. They and their team of consultants are referred to as the Boulder County Project Team. Tanya Lubert, Boulder County's BERT Project Manager, is here in person tonight, and several members of the BERT County Project Team are also here virtually to help answer any questions. OSMP was not part of the project team, but OSMP participated as part of the steering committee and provided input into the project team throughout the process. And the Boulder County project team also led a public process that included the community at large, as well as targeted engagement with stakeholders detailed on this slide. When the BERT process first began, it only considered trail alignments within the RTD right-of-way. But based on Boulder County Board of Commissioner guidance, the scope and timeline of the process were expanded to consider additional route options outside the RTD rail corridor in the interest of minimizing environmental and wildlife impacts, and to engage with Native American tribes and community members. This scope expansion resulted in the exploration and evaluation of the conceptual alignments shown on this slide. The alignments are the same between 61st and 75th Street, as well as east of 95th Street. And different options for how to cross 287 were evaluated, but since the 287 crossings aren't adjacent to OSMP lands, I'm not going to delve into those details. I'll go through each of the alignments briefly. Alignments 1A and 1B are fully within their RTD right-of-way. The alignment 1A is in the right-of-way, but not on the rail bed itself, but it does cross the rail bed as needed, while 1B is in the right-of-way with potential for the trail on top of the rail bed as needed. Alignment 2 uses a combination of RTD right-of-way, OSMP lands, and Boulder County right-of-way, and Valmont between 75th and 95th Streets. And Alignment 3 is a combination of RTD right-of-way and OSMP lands. The Boulder County project team selected Alignment 1B as the preferred alignment for further consideration based on the results of the technical evaluation, as well as input received from the steering committee and agency stakeholders and input from the public. So I'll walk through these sets of input in more detail. I know you can't see the detailed information on this slide. The point I want to make with this is that many different factors were considered as part of the BERT technical evaluation. The 3 conceptual alignments were evaluated using the 8 evaluation categories in the first column here. Within each of the categories were more specific evaluation considerations shown in the second column. So these 30 evaluation considerations received a rating of highly favorable, favorable, neutral, unfavorable, or highly unfavorable. And these evaluation criteria were considered for the full length of all the BERT alignments. So more details about specific considerations were shared in your memo, so I'll just be sharing kind of a high level of the evaluation results. This table shows the alignment ratings for the broader evaluation categories, where the ratings for the 30 considerations were rolled up. In summary, all alignments involve trade-offs between the categories. And in terms of how each of the alignments rated, as highlighted on this slide, all of the alignments ranked favorably for cultural resources. And then 1A and preferred alignment 1B ranked highly favorable or favorable for safety, adjacent property considerations, and trail user experience. It rated neutral for agricultural resources, implementation and maintenance, and highly unfavorable for ecological resources. Alignment 2 ranked favorable for ecological resources, neutral for trail user experience, and unfavorable for highly unfavorable for safety, agricultural resources, maintenance, implementation, and adjacent property considerations. Alignment 3 ranked favorable for safety and trail user experience, highly unfavorable for ecological resources with the most concerns for impacts to these resources, highly unfavorable or unfavorable for agricultural resources and implementation, maintenance, and adjacent property considerations. The Boulder County project team identified the following as top priorities from public input received: safety, specifically the separation of trail and roads, and environmental concerns, along with a desire to reduce impacts. Other significant considerations identified were quick implementation, a direct route, minimal impacts on private property, and scenic views. A statistically valid survey sent to residents or landowners near the proposed trail corridor that had 500 respondents indicated that 93% of those intended to use BERT, and 52% of respondents said they would use the trail 1 to 4 days per week. The Boulder County project team identified the following key takeaways from steering committee and stakeholder input: a strong desire to minimize environmental impacts and safety that a trail separated from a road would provide. And other values included feasibility, directness, and connectivity. Overall, the preferred alignment had the most favorable or highly favorable ratings and the least unfavorable or highly unfavorable ratings of all the alignments. As shown here, this alignment rated highly favorable or favorable within the safety, trail user experience, and adjacent property considerations. The safety category included a number of crossings and user sight distance, and alignment 1B rated most favorably in relation to sight distance and requiring fewer road and driveway crossings. The trail user experience category included directness of alignment, recreational value, connectivity to existing trails, trailheads and destinations, trailheads, and interpretive opportunities. And 1B rated highly favorably or favorably for all of these considerations. The adjacent property considerations category included the availability of Boulder County or RTD right-of-way and property to complete the project, and need for use of other public lands or private property and adjacent land use. Alignment 1B rated highly favorably for the first three considerations, since the entirety of the trail would be within the RTD right-of-way with no need for the use of other public or private properties. So staff is requesting that the board make the following motion: recognizing the benefits related to safety, trail experience, and adjacent property consideration, the OSBT support alignment 1B as the preferred alignment for further consideration of a multi-use trail connection between Boulder and Erie. Now, I'd like to share more of the context for the conceptual alignments in relation to OSMP lands. OSMP has adjacent lands for approximately 9.5 miles or 59% of alignment 1B. A large portion of those, 30% of these adjacent OSMP lands, have high ecological values as illustrated by their designation as habitat conservation areas. In this rolled up version of the evaluation results, you can see that the preferred alignment was rated highly unfavorable in relation to ecological resources. Alignment 1B was rated highly unfavorable in 3 of the evaluation considerations, including fragmentation of designated habitat, threatened or endangered or species of management interest habitat, and introduction of invasive species. It was only rated unfavorably in relation to wetlands because it had fewer impacts than 1A due to the ability to use the rail bed. The most significant consideration of concern in the ecological consideration category was that of threatened or endangered and species of management interest habitat. The reason it's of concern is the presence of nesting raptors that would potentially be impacted by the introduction of a trail and new activity in the area. Specifically, in the vicinity of Alignment 1B, there are 23 nesting sites for federally protected and sensitive species listed here. This led to additional conversations between OSMP, CPW, and the Boulder County project team, along with preliminary analysis of these existing nest sites. Typically, consultation with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and United States Fish and Wildlife Services is done closer to the construction phase of a project. But for this planning process, a preliminary consultation was done with CPW so that all agencies and decision makers could gain a shared understanding of CPW recommended protections and the potential that CPW's future recommendations for 1B may include seasonal closures or other limitations due to the high density of nests along the corridor. Here you can see the overall process used to develop and apply recommendations for the protection of nesting raptor species. U.S. Fish and Wildlife establishes the requirements for federally protected species. CPW then provides recommendations to apply these federal requirements and identifies recommendations for the protection of locally sensitive species. CPW uses state standards as a starting point, then confers with local land management agencies to develop location-specific recommendations. And OSMP has a long history of working with and applying CPW recommendations and U.S. Fish and Wildlife requirements. As a best practice, OSMP has always followed CPW recommendations and supports this continued commitment. For BERT, CPW recommendations apply to bald eagles, nesting raptors, and herons in the vicinity of the preferred alignment. This map shows the number of nests nearby the preferred alignment. These were the nests that were discussed further by OSMP, CPW, and the Boulder County project team. After analyzing the site-specific characteristics of each of these nests, such as disturbance from the proposed trail, level of disturbance, and nest activity, CPW developed the following recommendations. This map shows the portions of the trail recommended for seasonal closures in different colors along the preferred alignment to differentiate which species nests the closure is intended to protect. I want to highlight the fact that CPW is recommending seasonal trail closures for 7 of the nesting sites, which could result in the trail being closed for as much as 9 months out of the year. So to be more specific by species, for bald eagle nests, CPW is currently recommending no surface occupancy within a quarter mile of all eagle nests, with no new human use within the half-mile buffer, which means a seasonal closure of the trail for 2 of the 4 bald eagle nests from December 1st to July 31st. For the other 2 eagle nests, the half-mile buffer doesn't apply and no seasonal closures are recommended due to the amount of existing disturbance. For red-tailed hawk nests, CPW is currently recommending seasonal closure of the trail for 2 nests from February 15th to July 15th. These seasonal closures are recommended due to the extreme proximity of these 2 nests to the proposed trail and documented cases in Colorado of red-tailed hawks attacking people in defense of their nests. For osprey nests, CPW recommends seasonal closure of the trail for 3 osprey nests from March 15th to August 15th, with no human use within a quarter-mile buffer during seasonal closure. For 1 great blue heron rookery, CPW recommends seasonal closure of the trail from March 15th to August 15th, with no human use within 300-meter buffer during seasonal closure. So given these recommendations, this would result in trail closures between 75th to 95th Street for up to 9 months out of the year, generally from December 1st through mid-August. As part of the Boulder County project team, consultants ERO conducted a nest site analysis and developed their own set of recommendations in relation to these nests. ERO's recommendations do not include seasonal trail closures for any of the species. ERO recommends a quarter-mile buffer for all of the bald eagle nests and the use of additional visual screenings and plantings to minimize impacts. The salmon-colored lines here, they represent the proposed and enhanced visual screening. ERO also recommends use of additional visual screenings where the potential trail encroaches into the quarter-mile buffers for the 3 osprey nests. And they also recommend using additional visual screening where the potential trail encroaches the 300-meter buffer for the great blue heron rookery. This slide shows how the visual screening could potentially minimize impacts to red-tailed hawk and northern harrier nests. OSMP staff believes that ERO's conclusion that seasonal trail closures are not needed is inconsistent with our department's overall approach to wildlife protection. ERO's conclusions rest strongly on the effectiveness of proposed vegetative screening, and much of the current vegetative screening in this area is made up of non-native species that are planned to be removed. OSMP staff are concerned about the feasibility of establishing trees to be effective in mitigating potential human disturbance here. ERO's approach emphasizes protecting a nesting territory rather than individual nest sites. And this approach doesn't align with federal regulatory frameworks and CPW's and OSMP's nest-specific guidelines and approach for wildlife habitat protection. Boulder County staff are not making recommendations around this topic in this planning process. The Boulder County project team is proposing to explore minimization strategies with CPW and OSMP in the next design phase of the project. So for the reasons that I just went through, staff is requesting the second part of the motion. Recognizing the impacts of the preferred alignment to the adjacent OSMP lands with high ecological values, staff requests the board also support a commitment to follow CPW current and any future management recommendations for alignment 1B for the continued protection of sensitive and protected species. OSMP staff recognizes the obvious impacts to the visitor experience and trail functionality if seasonal trail closures were to be implemented. And these impacts were not accounted for in the technical evaluation ratings related to trail user experience. Given the direction to explore alignments outside the RTD right-of-way corridor in the hopes of minimizing impacts to resources, in the event that county commissioners who have decision-making authority for approving BERT directed Boulder County staff to pursue the most environmentally favorable way to complete this trail connection, OSMP staff want to highlight that conceptual alignment 2 was the only alignment to rank favorably in relation to ecological resource considerations, and that this alignment would not have the same number of constraints and potential for seasonal closures due to nesting raptors as the other alignments do. Hence, we're requesting this third part of the motion, that OSBT would also support further exploration of the easements, right-of-way acquisitions, negotiations, and costs associated with Alignment 2 along Valmont, if an effort to pursue the most environmentally favorable way to complete this connection is pursued. And finally, because this is only the planning phase of the BERT project, this slide shares staff's requested motion from the board in support of our continued collaboration with Boulder County on the potential next phase of the project as determined by the commissioners, including but not limited to further analysis, design, and exploring ways to minimize impacts to adjacent OSMP lands with high ecological value and sensitive resources. So short-term next steps for this project are that the BERT plan is an agenda item at the Boulder County Parks and Open Space Advisory Committee meeting on September 26th, and then a public hearing of the commissioners will take place on October 10th. And then in the long term, there are additional phases in the process that will be required before a trail is constructed. Following completion of this planning phase and approval of a preferred alignment and the BERT plan, funding sources and potential phasing will be identified and engineering design would begin. Boulder County will work on obtaining the necessary approvals and permitting, and the trail could be built in sections as funding allows. Pending approval, OSMP will continue to collaborate with Boulder County on the potential next phase of the project. So that concludes our presentation, and this slide shows each of staff's requested motions for OSBT, and now we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Also want to thank staff for taking us out to visit the site last Friday. A couple of us were able to join, and that was really helpful, I thought. Okay, so now is an opportunity for clarifying questions. We'll do a public hearing, and we'll have opportunity for more board discussion after that. But this time is for clarifying questions. Anyone?
I think it's good just for the public record to clarify the reason why it seems like we are moving forward with this project. This is something that has been determined to be necessary for the community, to be beneficial for the community. There have been many years put into this. What was the original, this is more of a question just for the public record, what was the original inspiration or why was the decision made to create a trail here? Can you provide more context there?
Regional trails are definitely a priority as OSMP partners with many surrounding communities on regional trails to reduce, climate impacts, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to, commuter traffic. So for many reasons, regional trails are a priority for us to collaborate on with other agencies. This has, as I said, it's been identified as an important connection in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, in OSMP's Visitor Master Plan, in the Boulder County's Transportation Master Plan for many years. And so that's why we've been partnering on this project for all these years.
Yeah, they've been spelled out in those larger plans. Go ahead, Brady.
Is there, we can talk about this more during the discussion. It strikes me as problematic to recommend an alignment that could be closed 75% of the time. Is there a reason you didn't just recommend alignment 2 as the staff? Why, like, and I guess furthermore, do you really think it's in the public interest to build a trail that will be closed 75% of the year?
So we wanted to support, as I said, the Boulder County project team identified for all of the beneficial reasons that I outlined, the trail user experience. Boulder County project team identified this as their preferred alignment. So OSMP also recognizes those benefits and wanted to support our partners in their proposed preferred alignment. And absolutely, we recognize the complications and impacts of the trail not being usable if seasonal closures were in place reduces the benefits greatly. And that is why we followed up with that third motion of alignment 2 as a potential thing to continue to look into the feasibility of.
Brady, I also think that it's point in time, right? So we're getting a set of CPW recommendations in early August of 2024. The trail is somewhat out in the distant future. Resource shifts change. CPW's recommendations may change at the time of trail construction and trail management. So there's also that complication, is that it's a point in time right now, and then a point in time in terms of construction and use is down the road. And so that also just provides some level of uncertainty of where we're going to be, 3, 5, 10 years from now too, as well.
Yeah, I understand that. I also understand that the GIS study of the nests and the closures are CPW's best guess with the available information on what the recommendations would be. And we can talk about this more, but it just seems like we're splitting the baby here. I think this is a community that tries to optimize for all variables a lot of the time, and we can't. We can't both have people not on roads at all and optimize 100% for safety and optimize 100% for protecting these particular birds. And I understand that you all disagree with the ERO analysis. So I just think it's untenable. So we can talk about that more later.
I'd like to ask a clarifying question, something that you said, Juliet, and I try to write it verbatim, but that the OSMP always, and it was the word always that piqued my interest, applies CPW recommendations. Is that a true statement that you always apply them exactly as they are provided?
So that has been our best practice. Like I said, this is a very preliminary consultation. typically it's an iterative process and a lot of conversation like further down into the design phase. In other projects, we've definitely had ongoing conversations, more than just a desktop analysis, going out into the field with CPW as well. And typically it's that, they listen to our subject matter experts who really know the on the ground information, and we kind of work together iteratively in developing those recommendations. So yes,
So you have
we-
deviated in the past from the initial recommendation?
no, we do always follow CPW guidelines, and there are some instances where we actually work with them and we do above and beyond CPW recommendations on our lands.
Okay. That's my recollection with some of the more recent changes to the closures. Okay. Thank you. Other clarifying questions? Otherwise, I'll open it up for a public hearing. Do we have, Harmon first?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's in the staff report, and we know this, but the report's long, so I'm just going to ask a couple questions to make it clear for everybody, so that
Sure.
it's all out there. So this is all a Boulder County project, correct? Yeah.
Correct.
And it's either in CDOT right away, or the RTD right away, or Boulder County property. It's the 1A and 1B are the easy rights of way to use, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And so we're not on the Boulder County task force or team that is designing this BERT trail, right?
Correct. We are not part of the Boulder County project team.
Yeah.
We've been stakeholders and members of the steering committee providing input.
Okay. And so as you showed that slide that had the sort of elongated arrow, and when is the trail estimated to be finally completed, if it goes along?
We've heard estimates of between 5 and 10 years.
Okay. Okay.
There's a lot more work to be done in future design phases and gathering funding sources. And
Yeah. So this is really a conceptual stage, and we're just being asked kind of like a referral agency, because we're another governmental body that is adjacent to Boulder County, to provide our input here. Yeah. Okay.
The
I
only
just want to make
difference
sure
would-
everybody got all that.
well, the only difference would have been if they used the alignment, because there was one alignment on OSMP lands. So alternative 3 would have been a different process.
Thank you.
Other clarifying questions? Okay. All right, let's open.
Thank you. We do have 12 speakers signed up at this point. Do you want to keep it at 3 minutes, or should we do 2 minutes?
So, 12 in total, including people who are present?
12, well, including hands that are currently up online, yes.
Okay.
And people who are present tonight,
Okay.
yes.
We'll go ahead and keep it at 3 minutes then.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with speakers who signed up online first. So we'll start with Richard O'Brien, followed by Wendy Sweet, and then Gary Sprung. Richard O'Brien is joining us online. Richard, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, there. Am I hearable?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, yes, I'm Richard O'Brien, 4500 Baseline, Boulder. And particularly, I was part of a team of people doing a research project on fireflies at CU Boulder. And my actual role was to videotape firefly behavior at Sawhill Ponds open space. And so I was there every night for several weeks. And so very familiar with the firefly behavior at Sawhill Ponds. And you may not be aware of it, but fireflies are very common in the eastern US, but they're very rare in Colorado. And this is one of only a handful of places that have been identified in Colorado as having fireflies. And this habitat goes right along the edge of the railroad track. So it would make a difference whether this were using the 1A alignment or the 1B alignment. With the 1B alignment, the trail would actually be on the railroad track itself, which is a little bit closer to out of the firefly habitat. But it might be worth considering like fencing off this region because it is, like I say, it's one of the only firefly habitats in Colorado, and that would be certainly worth discussing. My colleague, the leader of the study at CU Boulder, Owen Martin, I think who may also be here tonight, can say more about how rare this particular habitat is in Colorado. But I'm particularly involved. I was involved in videotaping the behavior at Sawhill Ponds, which is right along this BERT alignment. The fireflies do, we're seeing all across the railroad track and a few of them even on the south side of the railroad track. But the most concentrated area was actually inside the Sawhill Ponds open space property, just adjacent to the railroad track. So that is where we were talking about. I think that the trail could be placed on top of the railroad bed, and if the habitat were fenced off, that it would protect it somewhat. But it is very difficult to see this habitat. Hard to see these animals there because 11 months of the year they're in larva stage, and so they're hard to see. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And before we move on to other speakers, I would just like to throw out a request. If you are simply repeating something that somebody else has said, if you could make that brief, that would be helpful. Thank you. Next person up.
Next, we have Wendy Sweet, followed by Gary Sprung, and then Libby Phelps.
Hi, my name is Wendy Sweet, and I live in Boulder. I'd like to express my strong support for the BERT and share my perspective on the proposed alignment. I acknowledge and appreciate the concerns raised by OSP staff regarding the ecological impacts, particularly in the terms of habitat fragmentation and the protection of sensitive species. These concerns are vital for preserving our natural areas. However, I believe that the preferred alignment 1B, which utilizes the RTD right-of-way, offers an ideal balance between providing our community with a safe, dedicated trail and upholding our commitment to environmental conservation. This alignment leverages an existing corridor that has already been impacted by human activity, thus minimizing disruption to less disturbed natural areas. Supporting the BERT project with this alignment ensures a safe, car-free route for cyclists and pedestrians, which is crucial in light of our climate crisis and transportation safety issues. Investing in such infrastructure is essential as it offers a viable alternative to driving, reduces carbon emissions, and advances our sustainability goals. By avoiding less disturbed ecological zones and staying within an established right-of-way, Alignment 1B represents the best compromise between enhancing recreation opportunities and protecting sensitive species. I recommend proceeding with this alignment without imposing seasonal closures. Instead, I also support the EOS mitigations that do not require closures. Thank you for considering my comments and for your dedication to both community development and conservation. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks for not taking up your entire 3 minutes. Next person. And you emailed your comments earlier, so we got the gist. Thank you.
Next, we have Gary Sprung, followed by Libby Phelps, and then Bill Rigler. And Gary, if you are attending in person, and I don't see Gary online. Oh. So if I will move on and then we can come back to Gary. Libby Phelps will be next. Libby is joining online. Libby, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful, thank you. My name is Libby Phelps. I live in unincorporated Boulder County between Boulder and Erie. My partner and I would be really frequent users of this trail for transportation. So I'm speaking in support of a trail alignment that is safe, which is removed from drivers, and second of all, open year round. As we know, climate change is the critical environmental issue of our time. We must provide safe infrastructure for people who walk or cycle for transportation. And that means away from drivers. Just this past week, there have been 3 incidents of a pedestrian being struck by a driver in a crosswalk in East Boulder County. This is crossing major thoroughfares. And 2 of them were children on their way to school. We must have safe infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists if we expect people to reduce fossil fuel usage by getting out of their cars. I totally understand the concerns regarding habitat disruption. I'm both an avid cyclist and a birder. I've added to my life list a lot of species that I identified while riding, including a lark bunting, the Colorado state bird, just north of the proposed trail alignment. I regularly view osprey nests and heron rookeries from walking trails that are open year-round in Boulder County. And a trail that is only open 25% of the year leaves 75% of potential carbon emission reductions on the table. So I just ask you to consider the holistic benefit to the community. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Libby.
Okay, next we have Bill Rigler, followed by Dana Bove, and then Suzanne Webble. Bill, if you are joining us in person. Oh, sorry about that. I see Bill online. Bill, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, good evening. My name is Bill Rigler. I have lived in Boulder for 12 years. I had the pleasure and the honor of serving on Boulder's Transportation Advisory Board for 5 years. And a year and a half ago, my wife and I moved to Erie. I am happy to say that I've continued my board service and now serve on the Erie Open Space and Trails Advisory Board. I'm calling in tonight to share what I think is a distinctly Erie perspective on your decision. In all honesty, when I moved to Erie a year and a half ago, I had never been here before. And what I have learned about this community is incredible. 14 years ago, we were a community of 12,000 people. Today, we are 38,000 people. According to our new comprehensive plan, we are cleared for a growth trajectory of potentially 80 to 85,000 people in the next 15 or 20 years. We are the fastest growing community in Colorado. And as the speaker who spoke just before me said, there is a fundamental and overwhelming need for BERT to happen. And so even though I am serving on the Open Space Board, I want to speak in my personal capacity and advocate for option 1B. It will be a huge disservice to those of us residents who live in Erie and reside in Boulder County and pay Boulder County open space taxes and have been talking about and wanting this trail for years to have it closed down for 6, 7, 8 months out of the year. It will be a poison pill. Likewise, another poison pill is the option 2 that has been presented. It will create a logistical, financial, and legal nightmare to have to negotiate with all the property owners to be able, in order to cut through their driveways, cut through their lands, and it won't create the safe riding conditions that we hope. Speaking on behalf of somebody who, and a lot of community members out here who ride bikes, many of us have switched to gravel bikes because of the dangers of riding on the road, especially in East County, where they don't have the same sort of bike protections that we do. I believe that at least a few of us on that are following tonight's hearing participated in the Magnus White Ride a few weeks ago to honor the life and the tragic death of USA cycling champion Magnus White on Diagonal Highway. For the sake of all of the residents of Boulder County who would absolutely use this trail day in and day out, and for all of the proponents of the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan and the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan that emphasize the value of outdoor healthy recreation, please, again, I really encourage your support of 1B. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and nice to hear from you. Sorry you moved to Boulder, though. Next speaker.
Next, we have Dana Bove, followed by Suzanne Webble, and then George Gersel. So Dana is joining us online. Okay. And Dana, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, just did. Thank you. My name's Dana Bovey, and I'm going to represent myself and also our 501c3 research study group, Front Range Eagle Studies. The potential impacts for the proposed bird trail along the preferred alignment to nest and critical foraging areas and habitat are staggering. And I'd say that's a real poison pill for wildlife. I say kudos to some of the OSMP staff biologists for recognizing that the preferred alignment needs to be closed at least 75% of the year to protect these nesting sites. The idea that the city of Boulder would still recommend this preferred trail alignment after recognizing those needs for nest protections, that's disturbing. Also, thanks to the city staff for rejecting ERO's recommendations. We continue to find their methodologies again and again and again continue to lack good scientific standards. There's so many nesting sites and foraging areas that will be impacted, but I just first wanted to focus on the White Rocks area and the northern harrier nest, just that nest alone, just east of 75th Street. Northern harriers are a native species and one of the Boulder County species of special concern. Their nests are so uncommon and poorly studied in Colorado that CPW still doesn't include buffer recommendations in their 2020 guidelines. Yet, according to CPW's SWAP document, the northern harrier is listed as vulnerable in Colorado, and their greatest threat is the loss of appropriate wetland habitat all across their range. CPW further states that northern harriers avoid areas of heavy use, like what's now being proposed in the Burt Trail alignment, a trail that will bring hordes of pedestrians and bikes right through that nesting site for those northern harriers. If you talk to Will Keeley at OSMP or Christian or others there, ask them how many northern harrier sites, nesting sites they've seen in all their years of work at OSMP. They're rare and they're valuable, and that's a poison pill for them. And further, I'll just say that in terms of the bald eagles that we study, and we shared our studies with OSMP staff biologists, what we've shown is that their nest site to the east is only 1/3 of a mile from the trail. Foraging and hunting perches that they use are only 150
sorry,
meters
but your
away.
time is
You'll
up.
displace those birds. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, Suzanne Webble.
Yes, thank you. Suzanne Webble, and that will be followed by George Gersel and then Linda Andis George.
Suzanne Webble. I live in unincorporated Boulder County. And I was going to have a different presentation, but this whole evening took a different turn from what I was expecting. My opening was going to be, it's been 31 years that we've been waiting for this rail trail along the Union Pacific right-of-way. It's a railroad grade. It may not be perfect, but it's there. And there've been endless visitor master plans and citizen working groups, of which I've been on one for this task force of the BERT. Lots of meetings, a few site visits, and over those 30 years, I used to joke about how funny it would be if I was already in my wheelchair by the time this trail got built. it's not funny anymore because just a month ago I was in a wheelchair. And I want to be able to use the BERT, not just to walk on it. Occasionally I actually ride a bike, and occasionally I ride horses, and I would like to be able to use it for all of those reasons. Alternative 2 is anathema to horse people. There is no way you can consider horses along Valmont Road. There's trucks and all kinds of very dangerous things. So it's not just less desirable, it's also extremely unsafe. And it's unsafe for other trail users as well. So I don't think it's ready yet for a final decision. And I wanted it. I wanted to come here and say, yes, let's do it. Let's get it done. I'm not sure we're there. So if we have to take one of the alternatives that staff has provided, I would say let's go with 1B and just take a deep breath. There are 8 purposes for open space and mountain parks that are enumerated in the Boulder City Charter. Whether or not this trail goes through city open space, you can say we always have to find a balance between those purposes, and the environmental values, the environmental preservation does not get to trump everything every time. The environmental values got to trump Prairie Run, which was the East Boulder Trail for the county. And the commissioners made it pretty clear that they were going to crack down on Prairie Run, but they were going to pass the BERT. So for those of you who were not there at the commissioners meeting, I was. And I considered that a pretty fair trade-off. So I urge you to take that trade-off. And you can't always.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I'm really glad you're actually standing there and not using your wheelchair. So happy for you there.
Thank you.
Hope you get to use the BERT trail without a wheelchair. Next speaker, please.
Next, we have George Gersel, followed by Linda Andis George, and then Bev Baker. So George, if you're.
Thank you. George Gerstel. I'm here representing 2 organizations, Plan Boulder County and Coalition for Cycling. Both are longstanding organizations looking after different perspectives in Boulder County. However, we have the same position on this trail. One, we encourage you to continue to pursue alternative 1B and to continue to evaluate options to reduce the impacts to the wildlife in the corridor wherever possible. After all these years, it's critical that this trail be completed in a substantial way. If there's any option to avoid some of these critical impacts through a realignment that might impact city open space, that is something that we would support, but it's critical that this project move forward with necessary constraints to minimize impacts to wildlife and nesting birds. And so I'll be concise, but that's the position from both Plan Boulder County and Cyclists for Community. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Okay. Next, we have Linda Andis George, and then Bev Baker, followed by Catherine Smith.
Good evening. Linda Andis George. The first organization I joined when I came here back in the early 90s was the Boulder Bike Commuters. However, I have seen the light. So now I'm going to be a little bit in opposition. I live in unincorporated Boulder County now. I want to thank staff for the very thorough information packet for tonight. I found it all an engrossing read from start to finish. I really love the input on the BERT plan from CPW and the OSMP biologists because I had not seen that before. I hope you've had time to scan over my written remarks. They elaborate on the points I'm going to make as quick as I can. I hope you are going to approve the staff recommendation with some advice from you, further advice about the BERT planning, and I suspect that is forthcoming. When all this began 4 years ago, we were about to be engulfed in a pandemic. And as the plans began to be discussed, the attendance at the hearings and the open houses was sparse, as you might imagine. So it got off to a rather slow start, but it seemed to gather steam very quickly when I wasn't paying attention. The plan seems to have been developed mostly in the most obvious and simple way, like a mushroom, with professional transportation folks on the county side looking most intensely at the long desired RTD right away. I know I once lusted after that myself, but as I said, I've seen a light. Right now, I believe consideration of other routes has not been thorough enough. I think you've heard some substantive input from our great biologists, as well as the state CPW. You can see that the plan as it stands now skips rather blithely over the rich natural areas around it, and you are hearing some opposition on that line. Our groups of in-house biologists and botanists will be the first, or should be the first, to be deeply involved in alignment planning. I don't believe they were this time. So this year at last, we greenies feel that at last we're being listened to, but it's a little late in the game. It is still time, however, to make a course correction to this Titanic. It's time to look at alternative routes that are safe and scenic, and which will avoid many of the impacts on wildlife, insects, and plants. And I think if you take a look at my map, it's very squiggly, but that can be fixed. And it stays off the road, and it would avoid, as I understand it, most of those closures that we are all so worried about. If you decide to give the BERT concept a green light to proceed, please attach the recommendations to county staff that you're going to hear from my following speakers. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda.
Next, we have Bev Baker, followed by Catherine Smith.
Good evening, trustees. Can you hear me okay? I'm Bev Baker. I live in Louisville. I'm speaking for Boulder County Audubon Society's Conservation Committee and Board of Directors this evening. First, we support staff's recommended motion for the board to adopt this evening. We commend OSMP staff for working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife to develop protection measures for sensitive and protected wildlife species and for supporting further exploration of alternative routes and ways to minimize impacts to OSMP lands. With increasing human population and encroachment on wildlife habitats in Boulder County and beyond, it's critical that we protect the best remaining habitats. For the BERT, we believe this means following OSMP staff recommendations, especially further exploration of less environmentally harmful routes, a commitment to following Colorado Parks and Wildlife recommendations, including seasonal closures, and examining ways to minimize impacts to adjacent OSMP lands with high ecological value and sensitive resources. We contend further that this BERT planning phase should include consideration of use types and timing, especially through these sensitive areas. The primary sensitive area we're concerned about is from about half-mile west of Sawhill Ponds Trailhead over east through the White Rocks area on OSMP land. Examples of use type planning to include in the master plan would be prohibiting dogs and nighttime use, at least in these sensitive areas. A substantial body of research shows that the presence of dogs, even on leash, disturbs wildlife. Introducing nighttime use will negatively affect animals from white-tailed deer, bobcats and owls, to foxes and fireflies. I did have fireflies in there before the previous comments. Also, some limits on types and brightness of bike lights, for example, strobes, might be appropriate. We would also like to see discussion of other mitigations for wildlife in the master plan, such as wildlife-friendly fencing, visual screening, and underpasses for small wildlife like frogs and toads in wet areas. Smaller underpasses and culverts do not need to be complicated or expensive to have benefits, and the trail will provide a movement barrier for many small critters that need to move around. These are only a few mitigation examples, and site-specific measures would need to be fleshed out as the project progresses. In light of the irreplaceable species and ecosystems in the area and dwindling refuges for wildlife, We believe it's important to include mitigation measures upfront during this planning phase. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Bev.
Next, we have Catherine Smith, and then we'll move to speakers who have their hands raised online. So Catherine Smith.
Good evening. I'm Catherine Smith. I lived in Boulder City at one time. I've lived in Louisville for probably the last 13 or so years. I think that Boulder's open space and mountain parks are really remarkable, and they're a place that I visit often and enjoy, and I know that so many other Boulder residents do. So I just wanted to commend our staff and commend you for your services, for your thoughtful work about how to balance recreation and the needs of the land and the plants and animals that live on it. I think there are really two hard questions before you tonight. The first of those questions is what to do about the Colorado Parks and Wildlife guidance that has been provided. We know from the staff presentation that there is no precedent for overriding CPW and ignoring those. I also think that if you look at this from a statewide perspective, that CPW has been charged with coming up with a regulatory scheme that balances recreation and the needs of wildlife, and they provide guidance that applies statewide. Given the significance of Boulder City and Boulder County in our state, and the leadership that we provide so often in environmental areas, I think the impact of a decision not to follow the CPW's guidance would have ramifications far wider than you're probably thinking today, and that you're going to start to see other counties saying, well, if Boulder's not going to follow CPW's recommendations, why should we? I wanted to share with you a little bit from the Fish and Wildlife Services statement about how the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act applies. And they're talking about what is an immediate impact. And they say specifically that the definition covers effects that result from human-induced alterations initiated around a previously used nest site during a time when eagles are not present, if upon the eagle's return such alterations agitate or bother an eagle to a degree that interferes with or interrupts normal breeding, feeding, or sheltering habits and causes injury, death, or nest abandonment. So there is also federal law at stake here when it comes to those two raptor species. The second big question that I think you have before you today is what is the correct alignment for this trail? And I would like to say that I thought we'd found it, but I don't believe that we have. I would support.
Catherine, your time is up.
Thank you.
And also thank you for your email.
You're welcome.
Okay. Next, raising their hand online, we have Alexi Davies. Alexi, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Good evening. You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. This is Alexi Davies speaking for Community Cycles. Community Cycles is Boulder's nonprofit bike shop and advocacy organization with thousands of supporters and tens of thousands of followers. We advocate to get more people riding, thus we support the proposed BERT alignment with one exception. The closure for up to 9 months a year makes this trail not that beneficial. There needs to be mitigation to protect wildlife, but not of closure. A detour to Valmont would not be safe or comfortable for cyclists. With the current speed of vehicles on Valmont, a bikeable shoulder would not support Boulder County's Vision Zero commitment. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Alexi. Did Gary Sprung ever get on?
That is who I was going to check next. I don't see Gary Sprung online, so no. Okay. And if you would like to speak, please do raise your hand. Okay, no other hands.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and close the public hearing. And have some board discussion. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. Yeah.
Sarah?
My understanding is that based on, so I spent 3 hours this morning. My son got himself ready for school. I read all of the letters. I reread the 78-page addendum to this. I have really appreciated all of the input coming in from the community and also everything that has been said tonight. I really, really appreciate the various perspectives. I also took time to give a call to Dan and to understand the staff perspective just one more time to make sure that I'm getting my head around this. And I know that all of us here on this board care very much about providing guidance and input within the bounds of what we're able to do. My understanding is that this project is moving forward, that we are creating a corridor. And I personally believe that we do need to create a corridor. Erie is one of the fastest growing municipalities in the state of Colorado. And we are one of the premier destinations for people who want to recreate. I would much rather provide a corridor for people to bike in and hike in than to have them all getting into their cars to come into the city. I think that's a must. I don't see how closing down this corridor from a practical commuter standpoint would make any sense, nor from a budgetary standpoint. And I'm here to guard and protect our investments that we're making. So I do see the dilemma. This is a very complex conversation. I'm a very spiritual person. I'm that girl, like every hawk that flies by my window, I pause for a minute. I'm in the middle of, I'm the CEO of a company, and I'll pause my meetings to say, oh, the most beautiful hawk is sitting right outside of my window. And guys, I think this means something. I really care about these raptor species. And I also really care a lot about setting precedent. I don't take for granted that if we start to make decisions that ignore those referrals, those recommendations, those scientists who have committed their lives to protecting and preserving habitat, we're setting important precedents, and we should, I take very seriously our role here in Boulder as precedent setters. We are doing amazing things. So I'm sitting here and I'm asking myself, well, what is the right thing to do? And I'm really hearing that there is strong support for 1B. I'm seeing that we have room in the recommendations from the staff to leave an opening for further exploration of alternative routes. And I do also hear the plea that we make space for that. So I personally want to support continued exploration of alternative routes, while also being pretty firm about I don't think we're going to get anywhere fast if we try to close this down 6 to 9 months out of the year. Then why spend the money? Why go forward? So finding that way for minimal impacts while recognizing that these urban centers are growing. I think that is a really important task, and not ignoring we need to find a way, and I'll leave it, we're all here for a discussion. We need to find a way to ensure that we're not making it so that the CPW, am I getting the acronym right? I'm always terrible at those. CPW, thank you. We cannot invite in the CPW and then ignore their recommendations either. So I am, those are my personal perspectives. I think just to summarize, we need to find a solution here. It's happening. Number one, it's happening. Number two, we need to find a solution that ensures that we have access to this corridor year-round, especially in critical months. I mean, July through October, those are critical months. That's when people are really warmed up and ready to be commuting. And three, we need to do this while protecting these very important species to our very best ability, and to ensure, to take very seriously the precedent that we're setting as we move forward.
Thank you, Sarah. None? Okay.
Happy to go next. I've been struggling with this and thinking over it since I read it and read over the packet a couple times now on this section. You know, and the biggest thing for me is making a recommendation for a plan, and then also saying it's going to be closed 9 months out of the year. I'm really struggling with. But also I've thought through it, read through the recommendation again, and I feel like I think I see where staff's coming from, because this is a really difficult situation to navigate, right? Uh, we have the wildlife that we want to protect, and we have you know, commuting and building the trail that we want to support at the same time. Um, Ultimately, we also don't own the land that this is going to be built on, and we don't have any decision-making authority, right, to approve this or impose these rules. So Boulder County can do whatever they want here, right? So at some level, right, we want to go along to get along so that we can have a seat at the table, so that we can hope to put in as much mitigation as possible to allow the trail and protect the wildlife. And I don't know what that looks like, but you know, that was kind of where I landed. And I do think, you know, we could tweak the wording of the motion a little bit to more accurately reflect that we want to work with them to figure out how to not close it 9 months out of the year and how to protect the wildlife as much as possible. But also point out that, you know, CPW does have these recommendations.
Thanks, John. Saw you go off mute, Brady. Are you wanting to go next or no? Okay, you're on red. Do you want to say some things, Harmon?
Good, thanks.
You're good? Okay. I'll jump in and then I maybe let you go. Even though I usually like to go last. I absolutely, not surprisingly, support regional connectivity by alternative modes, transportation modes, for a lot of the reasons Sarah mentioned, and some of the other speakers. It's the right thing to do for climate, and supports our initiatives, our climate action initiatives, and our Vision Zero initiatives. So absolutely support that. I guess my main concern here has to do with timing. Um, you know, I know we have some initial CPW recommendations with that were done based off of, and Brady, you have the right terms, GIS analyses versus like a visual inspection of the site itself. And I know that would be forthcoming. I also heard Juliet say that the CPW consult is usually, when they would actually come on site, is usually done closer to construction, which we know to be 5 to 10 years away. We also know that the environment and the nesting habits change. And the advantage that we had for with going out there with staff is we got to look at the environment, look at the nest, the bald eagle nest. It's in a tree that's not looking too sprightly, and there we also got to look at the railroad bed and see what that proximity was from that nest. Also got a good view of the well, the gas well that's also not that far by, far from the nest. Also saw the McMansions there. Also viewed the other trails that are right around there and its proximity to the areas that we've been talking about. There's a lot of human activity happening there. And it's the second time I've visited that area with staff. We went there last year as well and looked at the restoration projects that were going on there. So it was really important for me. And I've been following this since I've been on the board, which is 2021, I think is when I got my my appointment. And it's something that I've been very interested in seeing come to fruition. Like we had the project was going down a certain path. I know you spelled out this in the timeline, and then it was kicked back for additional consideration, and specifically to look at the environmental impacts. We've done that. we've had a seat at the table. Staff has already provided their recommendations. It's already been introduced and cemented in the steering committee process. So what we are doing here tonight is what do we as OSBT want to do in terms of supporting this project, potentially with some closures or some like possible closures. I know, having been on this board for a few years, that previous OSBTs wanted to make a statement up front and stand in the way of public safety, health and safety projects, particularly in a point in the process. And this is why I say my issue is timing. Where we're not talking about management yet. We're not talking about how we're actually going to deal with that yet. I know that previous OSBTs wanted to make that statement up front. I don't think we have enough information. We're not far enough down the road. I think that there's going to be a lot of things that change between now and set 5, 7, 10 years. So my preference would be to support the 1B alignment without the conditions of following CP or committing to CPW guidance, which, by the way, is really preliminary. It's not based on an actual site inspection. That can happen in the next phase, and so I don't believe that that has to be done now. That's mainly how I'm coming down on this.
Thanks. I'll add a few things and hopefully not too redundant. Thanks everybody for the comments. I can't vote for the motion as written for two reasons. I just don't think it's in the public interest to move forward with the construction of a trail that could be closed 75% of the time. I think it's absurd, and to suggest that that would be in the public interest just doesn't make any sense to me. I also think that in the packet, there's a lot of back and forth between the ERO consultants and CPW and us, and there's some strong and passionate differences of opinion, which is usually evidence of a good decision-making process. So that's good. What I don't feel comfortable with is us weighing in and saying we're necessarily going to follow CPW, which basically is getting OSBT to side with staff, and then we don't. I just at this stage of the game, us weighing in on this debate, kind of to Michelle and maybe John's point about management decisions, it seems a little early. And I also know, John, you're right. We don't have jurisdiction over this ultimately. That being said, I don't think we should pass the buck. Like if the proposal on the table doesn't make any sense, I think we should say so and do our best to try to move things forward as opposed to just punt and say, well, and I guess the last thing I'll say is, and I also understand, and I may get this wrong, and if I do, it's my mistake, not anybody else's, but I also understand that I think there's a desire on the part of OSMP staff to ensure that our concerns don't get railroaded, and that CPW, with all their many years of expertise, are at the table at the minimum, if not being the ones who are deciding all the mitigation that is required. And so one thing I'm surmising is that the second part of the motion, which specifically calls out CPW, could be helpful to staff in the future to make sure when that day comes, and it may be a long time, years from now, that their expertise is given due consideration, which I respect, and I think that's positive. So I'm curious to know what other board members think. I've got some queued up language, a slight adjustment to the second part of the motion. I've got no pride of authorship here. You can mince it. I don't like writing things real time in front of the public on a screen, so I figured I'd queue it up. Can you put it up on the screen? Yeah. And so this would be, I'll read it, and you can read the original one if you like, but recognizing the potential impacts of the preferred alignment to the adjacent OSMP lands with high ecological values, The OSBT also supports a commitment to consult with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and other experts on management recommendations for Alignment 1B to protect sensitive and protected species and to minimize impacts on trail users. So that would be, in our discussions, my suggested starting point for something that I might be able to get behind. And I think would hopefully not completely pass the buck, but also arm the staff and our city with what we need to ensure that this sensitive area gets the due consideration and protections that it needs without completely blocking our other goals of regional connectivity.
We could just quickly compare that visually to, or what specifically is in. Can we just compare that to the original? So what specifically are you changing there?
Yeah, the key, one of the key words is consult with, the commitment to consult with versus follow. And other experts make an appearance.
Great.
And also minimizing the impacts on trail users, of which in this case, temporal closures would be a big part of that analysis. It wasn't in the color-coded matrix, but I think that was an oversight as well.
Since it's not a motion on the floor, are you open to edits now?
Totally,
or is that...
yeah. I just put this out there as a starting point. And if, again, if people don't like this, I think there was some discussion about whether or not we even want to weigh in this regard now. The only reason I would suggest going forward is I think it's important that we do what we can to ensure that CPW is at the table in the future.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, John.
I like this. I think it's much more agreeable. The previous wording, implied that we want to close the trail 9 months out of the year, which I think is kind of a non-starter, and it's going to potentially lose us that seat at the table to find a potential agreeable middle ground. Whereas this is much more agreeable language to me. It implies we want to work with them. We want to find a way to make it agreeable to both sides.
I would just like to offer a substitution of where it says the OSBT also supports a commitment to consult, would be supports consultation with. So, yeah, there we go.
Are we supporting or encouraging? Are we saying support feels?
Michelle, is this a substantive edit, or do you just think my grammar's kind of cruddy?
To me, it feels substantive. I don't.
What's in your view? What is the, other than it's better written in your view? What is the meaning? What is the shift in meaning as a function of this?
I guess it's that word commitment. I think I support the consultation. I'm not saying that we obviously would do that anyway, but I guess in my support of this, I would be more comfortable without that word commitment.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, Harmon.
So yeah, I actually had the same edit in my mind, and so my reason for that is that it seems kind of like we're imposing a commitment on another body, because we're not consulting with CPW. The project team would be consulting. So it's like we would be, in the old language, we're supporting a commitment to consult. Well, who's going to make that commitment? So I think by taking the sort of, you need to make a commitment to consult with CPW out of it, just say, we encourage or we support consultation seems cleaner to me.
Okay.
I love having a lawyer on the board.
It is nice.
Other feedback? Are you okay with that change, Brady?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the original language. I think, yeah, keep going. Let's keep the discussion going. What would you have to say, sir?
Because you can't. You're right that Harmon, you can't commit another body to consult.
My guess here, my best guess here is that CPW, if the task is to find the most sustainable approach to developing this trail, which must be a direct trail that encourages commuters to actually utilize the trail year round. If that is what they are, that is the task at hand, I believe that they will be empowered to find alternatives to just shutting down the trail. And I don't think that they are just coming in with a hard line and saying the only route here is to close down the trail. There might be other alternatives that they would explore. And I think we're going to be looking at budget issues of how much, when we talk about consultation and we talk about commitments, I think that what we're all saying up front is that we're supporting budget, resource allocation, time, energy to looking at the most sustainable protection that we can provide, the best protection that we can, not just sustainable, the best possible protection that we can provide for the wildlife in that very important preservation area. Yeah. So then I think some firm language is probably nice in here, that what we're saying is we want to, we're encouraging, or we're I think encouraging and committing and supporting. Those supporting is soft and committing is strong in terms of language. So if we put both of them together, I don't know where we land. So what is our stance if we're going to get really deep down into this language?
Was that an edit?
It's a question. I personally, I've shared my personal goal is to be pretty strong and firm that we really need to take the time and commit the budget and ensure that we are preserving the ecosystem to the very best of our ability, with, as it was said here, without inhibiting this project from moving forward, without investing millions of dollars as a community into a trail that's not really plausible, that we aren't using. We could put that money somewhere else, but we need to be, it's going to be put here, so let's do that well. And I think a portion of that should, a decent portion should be allocated to. When we get there, we'll get to make these decisions in a management way. But for now, up front, I think we want to make a statement, right? That's what we're doing here, that we support the continuance with these safety measures in place and with the empowering these agencies who know what they're doing to help us make strong decisions.
So what I'm hearing is that we have a little bit of wordsmithing, so some of it's meaningful to others. Since you put this up here, oh, and one thing to clarify, this is a county project. It doesn't come out of the OSMP budget. Just a point of clarification, because it's not our project. We're adjacent to it.
Then do we have the ability to even say that we?
We don't.
Okay, so we need softer language. We encourage.
Yeah, I mean, we can do what we want, but the Boulder County Commissioners are going to vote next month, and their vote stands. Where we are, John, I see you wanting to say something. Go ahead.
We could strongly support.
We could strongly support. Right now, we don't have a motion on the floor, so I think we could put a motion on the floor and take a vote, or we could tweak this a little bit and then.
Well, let's finish this edit right now. So let's get rid of a commitment to consult with. We can just delete that. Also supports consultation. That's fine. I think if everybody's happy with that.
The OSBT strongly supports consultation, or also supports. Are we also supporting it or strongly supporting it?
I don't.
Also modifies the first paragraph, which isn't up on the screen right now, which just says that we support alignment 1B, and then paragraph 2 says we also support consultation with Parks and Wildlife. I think the big thing is that the original language was a commitment to follow CPW, and we're pulling back on that to follow versus to consult. So I get the feeling like the board's pretty good with that change.
Yeah. Do you want to make?
So now we're just wordsmithing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's nice.
The recommendation is 4 points. Does anybody have anything? I mean, one interesting thing, and I don't want to belabor this, is 3 calls out alignment 2, which I don't think anybody who's interested in the trail itself is particularly interested in that. I think that's from my hearing of what I've been reading and public comment tonight, that's really only viable to people who are maximizing resource protection at the expense of a functional trail. I understand also that this number 3 anticipates potential tweaks to alignment 2. Is that
The kind of the spirit behind that is this is your opportunity to weigh in. We don't know what BOCC is going to do, but if the Board of County Commissioners ends up supporting alignment 2, do you want to be on record of also saying that you would support a further analysis of alignment 2? That's kind of the spirit, because we really don't know what BOCC is going to do. If they do too, do you want to be on record, quote unquote, of also supporting exploration of that?
I'm not a super, based on what I've seen, I don't super support alignment 2. It seemed we run into safety issues and all kinds of other issues. There was a pretty much unanimous feedback from everyone who came in support of this moving forward. I heard 1B, I read 1B. It does make sense to me personally, because we already have built railroad tracks there. So there's already an impact, and it seems like the least impact from if not considering the invasive species, not considering the birds and the animals living there, but in general, in terms of impact and construction, it seems like the lowest impact. So and it doesn't require people to be riding on the road, whereas alignment 2 seems like I don't know. I don't feel super excited about that or putting it. I don't really actually want to endorse it personally. I don't know what you guys think. Yeah.
I would as well.
I'd be okay with that.
Yeah, I would be okay with that, but I also like to point out that the qualifier in that is if an effort to pursue the most environmentally favorable way to complete the connection is pursued, then we'd support looking at alignment 2. So, if we want to just be, like Dan said, if we want to just be on record saying, hey, we're okay with that, if that becomes your priority, then maybe we just make it more clear that there's that caveat and we start it with if an effort to pursue, then the OSBT would support. So we just flip the 2 clauses and put the last one first. Otherwise, I'm fine with taking it out altogether.
Is there a scenario in which you personally would support alignment 2?
I mean, I think that as much as, I heard the lady talk about not wanting to put a horse on Valmont Road, if there was a good multi-purpose path along the road that got me some separation from cars, I wouldn't mind riding a bike along Valmont Road. So, it still could be a useful trail in that alignment, just not for everybody.
There was some mention of other alternatives, exploring other alternatives. And this is where I'm going to play the I'm new to this card. I have not been following this for 31 years. So I don't know how much, are we saying that we're committing just to alignment 2, or is there a way to say that we would, if the ecological impacts are determined to be too great, are we saying then it is alignment 2 that we are going with, or is there room to say we would encourage, we support alternatives rather than the alignment 2 alternative? That didn't look so great to me. I saw a lot of orange and red and yellow on that chart. I didn't see a lot of green there. It didn't seem to really, I wasn't moved this alignment 2, great idea. So
Can I just make one clarification, Sarah? We did, in 2021, there was a request to look at other alternatives, and that's what the project team did in 2021. And those alternatives that you saw there, which was Valmont and Alignment 3, were the other alternatives. So we did broaden out, already looked at alternatives, and so we weren't, as staff, requesting an analysis of further alternatives. So I just wanted to clarify that we're proposing that.
So then that would create more delays and more, okay, great. I see, thank you. So that was very helpful.
I think bullet 3 is superfluous because the recommendation that is on the table with the project team and the steering committee is 1B. I get it. If they got a wild hair and the county commissioners decided heck, let's go with alignment 2, sure, then we have a backup plan. But if they go with alignment 2, this is all kind of moot anyway. Yeah, we're gonna explore these other things because, of course, that's what you'd have to do. So I'm in favor of striking that.
You're getting a lot of nods on that, Chair.
Okay, cool. Any questions about our new number 3? I think that says a lot of the things that actually number 2 says, but around wanting to minimize impacts to adjacent OSMP lands with high ecological value and sensitive resources. Oh, go ahead.
Before we make a formal motion, I just wonder if Dan has any last minute wisdom or insight you want to lay on us here with what changes
I've
we've made.
appreciated your discussion. I think from what your body's understanding and personal preferences are, I think the wording you're aligning with is kind of representing what I think I'm hearing from y'all. So
okay.
I don't see any red flags here.
Would somebody like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion. And should I read the whole thing? Is that that's what we do, right? Recognize the benefits related to safety. It was number 1. Recognize the benefits related to safety, trail experience, and adjacent property considerations. The OSBT supports alignment 1B as a preferred alignment for further consideration of a multi-use trail connection between Boulder and Erie. 2. Recognizing the potential impacts of the preferred alignment to the adjacent OSMP lands with high ecological values, the OSBT also supports consultation with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and other experts on management recommendations for alignment 1B to protect sensitive and protected species and to minimize impacts on trail users. 3. The OSBT supports the department's continued collaboration with Boulder County on the potential next phase of the project as determined by the Boulder County Board of Commissioners, including but not limited to further analysis, design, and exploring ways to minimize impacts on adjacent OSMP lands with high ecological value and sensitive resources.
I'll second that. Any discussion about what's in front of us now? No discussion? No additional discussion? All right, I'm going to call the roll. Sarah?
Yes.
Brady?
Yes.
Harmon?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And I also vote for this. It passes unanimously. Thank you, everybody, for the time that you've put into this, staff members and members of the community. I know people are very passionate and invested a lot of time into this. So thank you. All right.
All right, and thank you, board, for the great conversation you just had. Chair, I'd like to propose 2 recommendations for the remaining minutes we have together tonight. 1 is a 5-minute break.
Okay. Done.
And 2 is that we were anticipating about a 60-minute item coming up, but we could go about, staff has put a lot of energy into putting a presentation together for you, which is about 30 minutes in length. So an alternative option we could look at is to hear the presentation tonight and then to and see where you're at. But if you're at like it's after 9, is to gather your comments, your questions in a written format. Staff can take that back and we could prepare answers to that and have a 30-minute session in October to kind of go over, here's your questions to that presentation. So kind of break it up into 2. 1 is the presentation tonight and to entertain some questions and responses at the next meeting.
I like that idea because there are a lot of pages. There's 2 massive reports in there, and I zoned in on like a couple of numbers because I know I bring up those numbers a lot. But so I think separating that is a good idea. Other thoughts? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So it sounds fine with me if we could just have, reserve a few minutes if we have some burning questions to help us guide the written comments that we're going to prepare
so
afterwards, just so we can have a little dialogue with staff before we adjourn. That would be good.
Okay, cool. All right. So I think we're good to take that approach, and let's take a 5-minute break. We'll be back here at 8:35. Thank you. online, and we'll kick it back over to you, Dan. Are you ready?
Thank you. We have one final item tonight, and that is to get a report on our 5-year data collection and analysis and assessment of our designated and undesignated trail monitoring and the results from that series of annual assessments over 5 years. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Haley first to introduce a little bit more of the topic, and then turn it over to our folks who will be leading us through the presentation.
Yeah. So just very briefly, I wanted to give just a few opening comments. In fact, I was going to stall while they're coming up here, but I don't need to do that now. So, because we took a break. But yeah, as Dan mentioned, this is kind of an overview of our trail monitoring, both designated and undesignated trails. And again, just to highlight, over the next few months, we're going to be focusing a lot on visitor use, visitation, visitor infrastructure. And so, think of it as kind of this trilogy, of chapters as we go, and stories kind of, they all lead and kind of blend together. We're coming back next month and the month after with everything from our public opinion and visitor experience survey. So that's about who's visiting, why are they visiting, how are they visiting, where are they visiting, all those things. And then the next one will be our visitation data, like the numbers and the counts and that sort of thing. So all that to say, like this evening, we've talked a lot about adaptive management and how do we manage our trails and recreation, et cetera. These are the tools and kind of the foundation of that. This gives us the data to understand where are we seeing changes, why are changes happening, how can we manage differently. So that's kind of setting the foundation. And it's also really good information about our asset management. How do we take care of all this infrastructure? What are the ways that we monitor? How do we make changes and make decisions about the information we have? So it's kind of a real robust data set, and that's why these reports are pretty thorough, and you're going to see even more. In fact, we're giving you data reports next month that we're going to give you a whole month to look at before we come back with an actual presentation. So trail design, trail maintenance, it's kind of an art and science. Tonight gives you a little bit of a peek into more of the science of how that works. So we really hope you'll enjoy it and ask questions. So with all that, we have Hillary Dees, who's our visitor infrastructure senior manager, and Jake Engelman, who's our trail research program manager, and tremendous work that they've done. So I'll turn it over to them.
There you go. Oh, great. Okay.
You gotta kind of speak it.
Perfect. Let's see. Leah just showed me how to do this, and I've already forgotten. Presentation. I just still didn't get it. Got it. Yeah. So I think Michelle alluded to this. There is a hefty amount of information in the packet this month about this information. So hopefully this will be a succinct 30-minute overview of all 150 pages or so of reporting, and then we can answer some burning questions and then let you marinate on that and then answer anything else next month. So this is a slide you probably see often. These are all the different master plan strategies that these two monitoring efforts support, both indirectly and directly. And we'll talk about how they support them, how we use this information throughout the presentation. So tonight, we're really hoping to talk about why we do this monitoring efforts, how we do it, what the outcomes are, how we use this information, what our next steps with this information is, and then we struck the questions from tonight. But I think a big question that some people might have is why do we spend time doing this? This is a really time intensive and resource intensive effort. And these are two different efforts. So Jeff mentioned this is both designated and undesignated trail monitoring. Both of these efforts were initiated in the Visitor Master Plan, so back in 2005, which my math says that's 20 years ago now, even though 2005 does not seem like that long ago. They are to be done on a 5-year monitoring cycle. And it doesn't just stop at the visitor master plan. So these efforts carried over into the master plan from 2019. So the tier 1 strategy for responsible recreation stewardship and experience, reducing trail maintenance backlog, and the ecosystem health and resiliency, reducing undesignated trails. Both of these monitoring efforts directly support both of those strategies, as well as the outcomes from both of these reports are the performance indicators for our budgeting for resilience and equity, which is our way of showing that we are taking the funds that we're given, using them how we say we're going to use them, and then having outcomes that we are hoping for. So to talk, getting rid of the Zoom thing on my screen, the designated trail monitoring specifically monitors designated trails, obviously. But what is that? So designated trails are generally designed and built to a certain standard. Now I say generally because we have inherited a handful of trails like the Royal Arches of the world for second CNISs after we purchased the lands. But designed and built, we have a trail management objective that we are trying to manage and maintain the trails to. And then this monitoring effort compares the physical conditions on the ground to what we hope to see out there. And then that difference is what we call our trail condition index. So how close are we to meeting the standards that we want to see? The higher the score, the better, like most scoring systems. Although the trail condition index score is on a scale of 0 to 100, and it's not like a ABCD grade like in college, it's in thirds. So if a trail has a condition index score of 0 to 33, that means it's not doing great. It is in need of critical repair. If it's in that middle third, it could use some work. It could slide down into critical repair, or it could just use a little bit of work and be in routine maintenance. And then the upper third, so anything that has a score of 66 or above is in routine maintenance. It's probably good to go. It just needs a little bit of love every year, and it will maintain where it is at. So that is what the designated trail monitoring does, is really in essence, how close are we to what we want to see on the ground? So all designated trails have this management objective, and then Jake goes around with this really great piece of equipment that we're going to show you. Gets photographed a lot by the public, like what are you out here doing? And then we see how close we are to that, and that helps drive a lot of the work planning that we do. For undesignated trails, those are not designed or built. Those typically are walked in, ridden in. Sometimes they're really old use patterns or old trail alignments that people just can't let go of. But they tend to fragment habitat. They can be a vector for invasive species, and they tend to cause a not insignificant amount of confusion with our visitors about where they're at on our system. And so the condition for undesignated trails is that we just don't want them on the ground. We'd prefer that they go away. And so for the undesignated trail monitoring, the outcome for that is that we want to know the linear extent of the miles of trail and then their relative impact on the system. So we, rather than assigning a condition index score that says how close we are to meeting our objectives, we assign a class to it. So is it high impact, medium impact, low impact, or there's a fourth category that's not a trail, and that's like if you squint just hard enough, sometimes you can see where something's just starting or something has been revegetated. And so again, the outcome for undesignated trail monitoring is really that, what is the overall impact of these miles across our system? Ooh, whoa. Sorry. So Jake is going to talk about how we get this information.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. So yeah, I'll start off by talking about designated trail monitoring. First, I'll kind of dive in a little bit to how we manage our trail system. So we use trail management objectives, TMOs. This was a framework developed by the Forest Service that we've adapted on our trail system. So each trail has a designed use, hiking, biking, equestrian trails. That designed use is often the most intensive use from a design perspective and building perspective. Each of those designed use then has 5 classifications, 1 through 5, 1 being the least developed, 5 being the most developed. And then there's also managed use on these trails. So if there's a biking trail that allows horses, we also manage for horse or equestrian use. Getting into the data collection, this data is collected in stations. So that's the most detailed information. multiple stations then make up trail segments. Trail segments, as you zoom out, are also part of trail maintenance zones. So we have 5 trail maintenance zones, each having a little over 30 miles of trail, and then your overall system. So we really have levels of detail that we can pull information for depending on the purpose. So since the 2005 Visitor Master Plan, there's been 4 iterations of designated trail monitoring. Only the 2015 through 17 and 2019 through 23, the most recent survey, used the same methodology and are really the only comparable surveys besides some other metrics. We use the High Efficiency Trail Assessment Program. It's a software developed by a company called Beneficial Designs. It uses that fancy wheel that Hillary mentioned earlier with a sensor package on it to gain a lot of these different measurements. So anytime a measurement changes, a station is taken, which resulted in about 60,000 stations on our trail system, which is about every 14 feet. So for every 14 feet of trail, we have measurements of grade and outslope. Again, grade is the slope of the trail itself. Outslope is the slope of across the trail. Also measurements for width, surface material, whether it's a natural surface trail, crusher fines, gravel, what have you. Measurements for surface firmness, any problems like erosion or braiding, any infrastructure along the trail, any retaining wall, culvert, drain dip is mapped and with an associated condition, and then a picture for every 14 feet of the system. So we can use those measures to then develop a trail condition index for all of our trail segments. Again, that's a score from 0 to 100, and it represents how closely a trail meets its assigned TMO. Again, it's not a grade scale. Don't think of it that way. If it's below 50, it's not failing. We break it into 3 condition categories. Routine maintenance, kind of like the top picture here. We're not too worried about these trails. We really just need to do routine maintenance sweeps to keep them in good shape. Your middle third, preventative repairs. These are trails that might need more intensive spot projects or smaller reroutes. And then your bottom third, the critical repair category, where we're needing very major repair work like Sanitas or large redesigns like Saddle Rock, and that's the picture of Saddle Rock on the bottom there. So getting into some of the key takeaways from the Trail Condition Monitoring Survey. Overall, there's an increase in system-wide trail condition index, about a 2-point increase from 57 to 59, which seems small, but it's pretty significant considering the amount of data we're talking about here. In 3 of the 5 zones, we saw improvements. The only zone we saw a decline in condition is zone 1. That's kind of the eastern part of the system. And some of the work that's been done this year in Gun Barrel Hill and then planned work in Boulder Valley Ranch, I anticipate that zone will probably improve in condition in the next round of monitoring. Kind of our problem child for trail maintenance zone is trail maintenance zone 3. It's remained our lowest scoring zone. That's our mountain backdrop there. It contains a lot of the legacy trails Hillary kind of alluded to. Condition remained fairly stable between surveys, but I'll talk a little bit more about that zone coming up. From a design perspective, grade was the parameter with the highest effect on condition. So where we saw failing infrastructure, problem features, the average grade in those areas was almost double than the areas that didn't have any problems or failing infrastructure. So had a really strong correlation with where we're seeing problems. And that's not necessarily a new finding from a trail design perspective. It just reinforces some of our current practices. This figure just kind of gives you some knowledge on what the percents mean. Residential staircases on average 75%. Industry standard for sustainable trail building is about 10%. And then again, where we're seeing our infrastructure failure is about 18%. Kind of mentioned legacy trails. These are the trails that have been adopted to our system. The Saddle Rocks, the First, Second, Flatiron, Royal Arch, those types of trails, they really have a strong negative effect on our overall trail condition index. I kind of pulled up just an example of Saddle Rock here. The average grade is above 25%. So, you know, if you think about where we're seeing problems at 18%, it's not really a surprise that Saddle Rock is scoring low in our condition index. The map on the screen here is showing aging infrastructure, which is also having a large negative impact on our trail condition index. So this these red dots on that map are just failing check steps in trail maintenance zone 3. So it kind of gives you, it's just one piece of infrastructure in one maintenance zone, kind of gives you an idea of the scale of aging infrastructure on the system.
Failing check steps, could you define that for the
Sorry,
group?
like any wooden step that you come across on a trail that's not connected to another step, especially in trail maintenance zone 3, you can think of those round wooden steps you might come across on the Ranger Trail or something like that. This is a map. I don't expect you to take all this in. The trails in purple saw a significant decline, and trails in green saw a significant improvement between the two surveys. And with that, I'll move on to undesignated trail monitoring. Again, very different kind of topic. We're not assigning TMOs to undesignated trails. We're really not managing them at all in the same way. And the data collections is slightly different as well. So undesignated trails are collected as points, which make up larger segments, and it kind of rolls up in a similar level of detail. And really, we're just looking for that linear extent and the condition of trails, undesignated trails on our system. So there have been iterations of undesignated trail monitoring going back into the 90s. Really, the only surveys that are comparable with methodology are the 2012, 2018, and then the most recent survey, which used, again, that point collection. Every point has a photo associated with it, a pathway type, whether it's a trail or a road. Any built infrastructure is recorded along those trails. Condition class, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. The function of the trail, so whether it's a shortcut, climbing access, community access, all these things are recorded with each point. And new to the most recent survey, we're collecting width information. So we don't have trends on width information on undesignated trails, but we hope to moving forward. So again, I said I'd touch on condition class. It's kind of the meat of the condition information that we have on our undesignated trails. So we're recording anything from a use pattern that doesn't necessarily meet the definition of a trail and doesn't get counted in the final total mileage to high impact trails. And hopefully these pictures kind of show that impact scale. So some of the key takeaways from the most recent survey. So after the 2018 undesignated trail survey, it was recognized that past data sets held a lot of undesignated roads that serve key functions for open space, like water conveyance, agricultural uses. And so there was an interdisciplinary team that sat down and looked at these roads and reclassified about 30 miles of roads that are more service. You know, these weren't roads that we were ever going to go and restore. They serve important functions, and so they're better managed as something else, service roads. In addition to that, this year the climbing access core management team was formed to look at some of the climbing access within the undesignated trail data sets. The total mileage from the most recent survey was 117.7 miles, which is a huge decrease from our 2012 and 2018 numbers. Even when you factor out those roads that we reclassified, you're still talking about a 29 mile and a 14 mile decrease from 2012 and 2018 respectively. Just like past surveys, the majority of that mileage does reside in that high impact condition class, and that's due a lot to our soil type and vegetation types. Once you start having a lot of visitor use on one particular area, those impacts really escalate quickly. Although the proportion of those high impact trails has gone down since 2018, and the proportion of low impact undesignated trails has actually increased. Touching on our management area designations, our passive recreation and natural areas really do have the highest concentration of undesignated trails and designated trails as well. So we really are concentrating recreational use to those areas. Habitat conservation areas do have a high mileage of undesignated trails, but it's not nearly as concentrated. Of the 117 miles, nearly 2/3 of the miles surveyed were present in past undesignated trails surveys. So that kind of highlights just how historical some of these use patterns are and how difficult it is to manage a lot of these trails. There's also a dynamic aspect to undesignated trails. Nearly 19 of the miles mapped were new to any survey. So There are trails popping up, disappearing in these surveys, but most of it has been there for a long time. A category where a lot of climbing access, or sorry, a lot of undesignated trail mileage was added was the climbing access, and it kind of highlights the importance of the climbing management core team. Along with undesignated trails, 340 areas of concentrated use. Think of high impact areas like viewpoints were also recorded, and that was a big jump from the 2018 survey. For system-wide trends, we saw decreases in undesignated trails in 4 of the 5 maintenance zone. The only maintenance zone we saw an increase in undesignated trail mile was maintenance zone 3, and that's a lot of the climbing access there and that mountain backdrop. I'll take a moment to just highlight there's a lot more analysis and supplemental data in the reports, and would encourage you to take a look if you haven't, and then I'll turn it back over to Hillary.
Just a quick summary of all 150 pages from the packet. But generally speaking, I think the really big important key takeaway is that our overall trail condition index has increased, meaning that we are getting closer to meeting the standards that we have set for ourselves with our designated trails. Jake mentioned it, Zone 1 did see a slight decrease, but we have already done major repair projects in Zone 1 and have major repair projects planned for Zone 1 over the next survey timeframe. And while 2 points might not seem like a lot, when you're thinking about a crew hiking up to the summit of Mount Sanitas every day for 4 months, and that we only have a 4-month building season, moving the needle like at all seems like a heroic task. And the fact that we were able to move it 2 whole points and bring a bunch of things that were in critical repair and like start moving them up the ladder of getting close to routine maintenance, it's something that I think the trail program should be really proud of, how we've used a variety of resources to make that happen. And then similarly, the overall extent of the undesignated trails has fallen, in addition to the overall impact of the classes has fallen as well. So everything is trending in the right direction, which is just really great, because sometimes it feels like there's more work than could literally ever be done, ever. So seeing these numbers is very helpful. So some of the ways that we do use these numbers, we mentioned it, but the trail design principles is probably the thing that I think is the coolest way that we use this information. So trail design as a recreation, as a just thing that people do, is pretty new. Like in terms of charter purposes that open space manages, agriculture, it's been around since time has started. Like biology, conservation, long history. People just recreating to recreate, pretty new. So as we learn through experimentation, through reroutes, through design, what worked, what didn't work, like seeing that Mount Sanitas was built in, I actually don't know when Mount Sanitas was originally built, but it is on a map from 1922. So we look at it over 100 years, when the Front Range population was less than the amount of people that visit annually now on that trail. Knowing that we can, in almost real time, see whether or not the design principles that we're applying are working is really helpful to then pivoting and making better and better and better and better trails. Similar to the map that kind of looked like the Flatirons had chicken pox, we can see where all of our infrastructure might be failing, or where we might need to adjust resources or understand how our practices are working or not working. It wouldn't surprise me if some poor junior rangers had to schlep up all those rounds 40 years, whenever the junior ranger program started, and that we now need to start planning for replacing that. So understanding the infrastructure trends of specific infrastructure is super helpful as well, and breaking that down by, you know, how are things doing? Are they doing what we're expecting them to do? And then the last, especially for the designated trail management piece of this, is really understanding what the cost of doing business is. So this graph is also in the report. I'd like to point out that between these surveys, we added 4 miles of trail, which might not seem like a lot, but it's not nothing. And so the fact that we were able to keep the same percentage of trails in routine maintenance across these surveys and saw a 3% reduction in those trails that need critical repairs shows that we really are focused on bringing up that condition score, and that this kind of speaks to why the condition score like rose by 2 points, but why we were so excited about the fact that it rose by 2 points. And then more specifically, we're able to do a pretty good job of understanding what our deferred maintenance costs are across the system. So like how much, how many, how often, what do we need to maintain a natural surface system? Jake talked about how grade is the biggest influence on trail condition, which when we were talking with the trail program managers about these preliminary results, the very astute point was made that mountains erode and gravity is real, which are both true. And like as soon as you go off of a work site where work has happened, you start seeing erosion from rain, from wind, from visitors. And so we're constantly playing catch up against that because we are a natural surface trail system that sees a huge amount of visitation in an urban proximate environment. So being able to say, here's how much it costs per zone, here's the types of trails in the zones, here's what we need resource-wise, here's how we dedicate those resources, is super helpful. So again, between these surveys, we added 4 miles of trail, and we're still able to reduce our estimated deferred maintenance backlog by $1 million, which I think is pretty neat. So our next steps for using this data is really to continue focusing on these high impact projects. And that's across both designated and undesignated trail projects. Oftentimes those look like very labor intensive projects. We're talking about Saddle Rock for a second, places where there's also a lot of overhead to even getting crews in to start building for the day, on top of only having about a 4-month building season with our full crews. But I think the previous graph that showed that routine maintenance kind of stayed the same shows that we're walking and chewing gum at the same time. We're able to maintain our routine maintenance. We're doing what we need to keep the good stuff good, and then we're really focusing on the worst of the worst to bring up the overall condition of designated trails, and then focus on high impact undesignated trail restorations as well to reduce that linear extent and the overall condition of the undesignated trails. Additional next steps, really, we feel very good about where we're at with the level of resources, the level of staffing that we have. I think we're within industry standards and about how much we're spending for deferred maintenance costs, for total replacement costs, things along those lines. One area we do want to expand into is having more volunteer opportunities for undesignated trail management. So we found over the last 2 years that that's been a really valuable volunteer events, and also it's a good way to get a bunch of work done very quickly. So looking to expand in that area specifically. And then back to the cost estimating. So by 2030, we'll have a much larger breadth and width of project costs that we'll be able to more fine tune. You know, this trail was in preventative maintenance, and then we did this project and it cost us much money, and this is what the labor, and we'll be able to update it and have an even more accurate number for our deferred maintenance costs. And I think we've ended exactly right on time for what was planned.
Nice job, Hillary and Jake. This is a great presentation. Burning questions. No. It's so hot in here. We're burning. My only burning question, besides why can we not get the HVAC working here?
Spending it all on trail maintenance.
The cost per linear foot from the 2015 to the next data set, we just know with like inflation and stuff,
So we kept the exact same numbers, so that should be, that's an apples to apples comparison.
Okay.
For the same, so we kept the same labor costs across surveys. So that did not adjust for inflation because labor has changed
a lot, and
a lot.
especially with
The
minimum
upper
wage
range
changes.
of those is actually a 30% inflation. So you could look at the upper ranges as well.
Okay.
That's kind of the goal there.
So in the 50, I know that I've always been stuck on this $40 million, and I think a lot of people in the community of a backlog of maintenance, and so it's still in that neighborhood. But as
It's
you pointed-
38. I want new terminology. Come on.
Chipping away.
But yeah, I get that the distribution of the critical repairs is changing, so that's good. Brady?
I think I heard one detail that there are high impact use zones in undesignated trail areas that are on the increase. And what is that? And I guess my question is, are there use patterns? Have wedding photographers increased in Chautauqua? Are there more people putting their hammocks where they shouldn't?
It's funny you mentioned Chautauqua because this is an area that we saw a lot of these areas of concentrated use pop up on a lot big increase. Yeah, these are kind of your viewpoints, your even climbing belay areas, bouldering areas. So it's a wide range of different uses, and it's not really a trail, but important to keep track of, and that almost doubled since 2018. So it's
do you
across the
have a
system.
theory? Is that just because there's more people visiting, or are there emerging uses that weren't present before, or both?
That's really tough to say on that.
I feel like the next step for those, so the undesignated trails, like as these methodologies evolve, like the first round was just like, where are the trails at? And that was the only information we had. And now we have all this other information. So those areas of concentrated use, I feel like are maybe that next step of like, what is the intent? Do we think this is photographers? Is this just a really nice viewpoint? We should build a trail to it and then manage it as that. Like, I think that's maybe the next step for adjusting the methodologies, like really understanding that, because that goes a really long ways in figuring out how to manage them, especially if we're trying to get them to go away.
Okay, last question, because I know we're late. What does this mean for the budget? Is there? I mean, there's some good stories in there. I agree. 2 points, trend line over. You said it very succinctly. Natural surfaced, high use trails near an urban area. That is a hard, constant problem to solve. The OSBT will be talking about this 50 years hence. I guarantee it. That being said, 39 to 50 million is still a really big number of backlog. Do we need to throw more money at this? Do we need to stop doing some things so we can start doing more of that? Dan, what's your takeaway in terms of what does this tell you?
Well, I think one of the figures, what is the industry standard of how much we invest in our operating dollars and our CIP dollars to maintain our trails, and we are within industry standards of investment. So compared to what you would typically want to see from a land management organization, we're in line for the amount of investments that we're putting to a system like this. I think we have a few unusual sort of bolder things happening. I think it's our legacy trail system is if Boulder County, much newer, they had the chance to probably put design trails on the system from day one, where we inherited a lot of trails that, quite frankly, we probably wouldn't have put them in that exact spot if we had our druthers. So I think it's the legacy trail system that really makes these results even more impressive because of the extent of that system. We're never going to put them in the right grade unless we got rid of them. And I think you don't get rid of the Sanitases and some of those trails. So I think that's the other main aspect that really takes a lot of resources to manage, that is maybe atypical of some other land management organizations that are a little bit newer than our 125-year system.
Go ahead, John.
All right, hopefully a quick one. What do you think is the biggest thing that's driving the decrease in undesignated trails?
You would think, but it's not. I think I put this together. So the board, I think you and Michelle got to hear my last presentation in 2022 when we had a temporary crew lead. And that had just started that year. And so since then, just that one crew has applied restoration treatments to about 10 miles of trail. And so that's been both active and passive. So active meaning they got in the ground, dug up some stuff. There was a picture from a volunteer event. And we've actually gone back and done a second and third round now for some places of restoration in those areas. So some of it is because we are actively managing it. And some of it is, I think Jake alluded to, just the passive nature of like, some of these are just ephemeral and they're like, that's really cool. I'm going to go over there. And then it disappears the next time. But then also there's we're currently at the Cragmore access point, building the trail up to the Shanahan Ridge, or North Fork of the Shanahan. And that we looked at the base map, that trail has been on the ground since before the crew leader was born. So we're also managing trails along those lines through designations and things like that.
Yeah, but that's a good point. After the master plan, when it was one of the ways for managing for increasing vegetation is to like take a look at our undesignated trails. We actually created a dedicated team of, instead of like borrowing from all of our trail builders, say, hey, today go out and take care of some undesignated trails. We have a specialized team now that is doing that. So that was a sort of a funding strategy and just a organizational allocation strategy that we employed a few years ago.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, and no other questions or comments. If we have any additional ones, we'll follow up over email. Sound good? Okay, I noticed that you didn't have any director updates tonight.
Well, I didn't feel the need. I mean, we were at 9:05 and I just figured I got to cut out some time here. I'll cut me out. So.
We cut you out last time. Okay, thanks everybody. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.